Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something reckless. We're going to follow the scent of cinnamon and sweat across continents. We're going to unzip history's silk robe, tiptoe past the guards, and see what really happened behind those heavy velvet curtains of ancient trade. This isn't your average story about camels and spices. This is the one about lust as currency, about sex traded like salt, about silks clinging to the skin of emperors and what they were willing to pay for a peek beneath. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments so I can see where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying on a sand dune. You can hear the camels grumbling, the kind of exhausted groan that says they've had enough of hauling people's luxury cravings across 4,000 miles of raw terrain. The stars are cold pinpricks above you, but the ground is still warm from the day's sun. Someone's boiling water nearby. It smells like cardamom and sweat. You think this is a break? But it's actually a transaction. Always is. Because out here, under the sky that stretches from the Yellow River to the Roman Forum, nothing moves without motive. Not cloth, not clove, not people. Especially not people. The thing is, the trade routes weren't just veins for goods. They were neural pathways for desire. You probably won't survive this journey, not because of bandits or storms, though there are plenty, but because of how brutally human it all is. These routes pulsed with need. They were moist with longing. They carried silk. Yes, but also secrets, kinks, whispered legends, and entire industries built on who slept with whom. The Silk Road, for example, sounds delicate, silken, feminine. Maybe. But it was a road of blistered feet, of silk clinging to backs slick with fear and heat, of merchants who carried not only bolts of cloth, but the perfume of lovers they left behind, or the ones they picked up for a night's stay at the next caravanserai. Picture this: a trader from Chang'an unwrapping a bolt of embroidered fabric in the center of Baghdad. The cloth is light as breath, nearly transparent. The woman he sells it to, wife of a minor noble, runs it between her fingers, her eyes narrowed. She's not just buying fabric, she's buying transformation. When she wears it, her husband will see something foreign in her, something costly. He'll wonder where the silk came from. He'll wonder what else she's been buying when he's away. Desire. Here is strategic. It moves like mercury. That silk is going to start a fight. That fight might end in sex, or exile, or a bribe for more. The earliest trade wasn't between cities. It was between people who looked across the fire and wanted what the other had. A better knife, a shinier bead, a more obedient lover. That last one. Yeah. Human trade goes back so far, it makes you itchy. And while yes, slavery existed across these routes in horrifying scale, there was also something more insidious: voluntary exchange disguised as freedom, royal marriages that weren't really choices, temple dancers sold as holy offerings, women who followed merchants, calling themselves entertainers, wives, sometimes spies. Historians still argue whether the courtesans who followed the Indian spice ships were empowered or exploited. The answer is probably both, or neither. The documents were written by men, but don't get smug. Modern listener, your world is still haunted by this ancient sexual economy. Every time someone describes a luxury product as exotic, a silk trader from 1,000 years ago twitches in his grave. Every time a politician wears a tie made of Thai silk, Or a perfume ad shows a woman rising from a desert in slow motion. Barefoot and glistening. You're seeing a fantasy hand-delivered by the ancient trade routes. The fantasy that desire can be shipped, sold, and draped. Here's a secret: one of the most popular forms of diplomatic currency on the ancient trade routes was the concubine. Forget coins. If a Chinese emperor wanted to impress a Persian envoy, he might send silk. Yes, but he'd also send singing girls. These women were trained in etiquette, seduction, poetry, sometimes assassination. There's a record of a royal woman sent to the Mongol court who arrived dressed in 16 layers of silk and promptly seduced the translator. On purpose. That wasn't a slip-up. That was espionage in heels. Well, in embroidered slippers. Meanwhile, the Romans were losing their minds over silk. Literally. Rome's fashion elites got so obsessed with the sheer, clingy fabric coming in from the east that moralists like Pliny the Elder started clutching their togas. Our women parade around in garments so thin, he huffed, they may as well be naked. The Senate actually tried to ban the stuff, not because it was foreign, but because it was too sexy. It made Roman men weak. Poor Pliny. You can almost see him fainting at a fashion show. But back to the dust and the dark. Back to you. Half asleep under stars. Your caravan is full of goods, peppercorns, sugar, opium, honey. But what you're really carrying is hunger. A craving that stretches beyond borders. Maybe it's for a lover who smells like jasmine and danger. Maybe it's for a throne. Maybe it's just to be remembered, even in a side note of someone else's scroll. And as you pass the next encampment, a circle of tents glowing with lamplight, you hear it again. Laughter, faint music, the clink of cups. Somewhere inside, someone's body is currency. Someone else is paying in stories, or promises, or salt. Yes, salt. Salt was once worth its weight in gold. It preserved meat, paid soldiers, and doubled as currency. But in desert towns along the trade routes, it was sometimes exchanged for sex. A block of salt for an evening's warmth. The idea seems strange now, but then again, how is it different from what we still do? Swiping, tipping, gifting, commodifying attention. The tech is fancier, but the trade is the same. And speaking of strange, here's your quirky tidbit in some Egyptian marketplaces. Sellers used to sprinkle powdered crocodile dung around their stalls to repel evil spirits and nosy neighbors. Some even used it as early birth control, rolled into pessaries, allegedly to keep things fresh and scare off sperm. You really can't make this stuff up. Again, historians debate whether it worked, spoiler probably not, but it does reveal just how closely sex, commerce, and belief intertwined. So here you are, drifting through centuries, listening to camel hooves beat like heartbeats, watching the silhouettes of traders and thieves and lovers against the firelight. And all of it, the silk, the salt, the glances traded across languages, it's humming with a single truth: people have always wanted more. More pleasure, more power, more perfume. You feel it, don't you? That pull. The way your mind starts spinning stories just from the scent of jasmine on the air. Yeah, we've only just started. You wake before the sun. The desert is still blue with night, but the camp is already stirring. You can hear the low rustle of tents being rolled up, the snort of camels resisting their saddles, the clink of metal buckles as traders prepare for another day under a brutal sky. You stretch, crack your neck, and taste the dryness in your mouth. It's not thirst, it's anticipation. Because today, you're heading toward the salt trails, the ones that glimmer like bone across West Africa and beyond. Paths etched not by choice, but by necessity. The kind of routes that teach you something about want, about value, about just how far a person will walk for something their body can't make on its own. Salt isn't sexy, you think. But then again, it kind of is. It preserves flesh. It flavors skin. It keeps desire from rotting. In the Sahel, slabs of salt were stacked like gold bars and guarded like relics. Caravans trudged for weeks across cracked earth, pushing through mirages and rumors just to deliver a few shimmering bricks of the stuff. Salt was life, and life, as always, came with strings. Kings hoarded it. Soldiers were paid in it, hence the word salary. Entire towns grew around its distribution, and wherever there was salt, there was sex. Sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt, sometimes written in ledgers, and sometimes etched into the soft gasp of someone taken behind a market stall. Let's zero in. You're in Tagaza, an ancient salt mining settlement in what is now Mali. The walls here are built from slabs of salt, stacked like giant sugar cubes. There's no water, no real food, no women officially allowed, but there are still whispered encounters in the dunes. Stories of men who pay in salt for the company of wandering dancers. For a night of remembering, they're more than just merchants or miners. One local tale tells of a Tuareg salt lord who fell in love with a Moroccan spice carrier. They only met when the caravans crossed twice a year, but each time, he paid her weight in salt just to hear her laugh. Historians still argue whether this tale is romantic fiction or economic allegory. But either way, the point sticks: intimacy travels, and not just in the ways you'd expect. In these remote salt towns, traders brought more than goods. They carried gossip, rituals, songs, and erotic charms. One particular fetish object passed between caravans was a carved ivory figure, small enough to fit in a palm of a woman lying on her side, smiling. Her hips were exaggerated, her hair coiled in the Fulani style. Supposedly, carrying it under your pillow brought dreams of a lover who would never betray you. Or, depending on who told the story, intense nighttime sweating. Either way, it sold out fast. The body, after all, is an economy. Every touch is a transaction. And in these early economies, where coinage was rare and literacy even rarer, trust often passed through bodies before it passed through contracts. You'd have dinner with someone before you did business with them. Sometimes dinner turned into drinks, sometimes drinks turned into bed, and sometimes bed turned into leverage. We've got records mostly from male clerks of disputes over promises made under the influence of affection. In other words, pillow talk, deals gone sour. A Saharan merchant promised 3 camels and a bolt of cloth to a lover in Timbuktu. She wrote a note. He vanished. Years later, that note was found inside a salt vault, pressed like a fossil between ledgers. Again, scholars debate its authenticity, but the handwriting matches royal script, and the ink still bleeds with heartbreak. Meanwhile, far from the sands, salt was shaping borders. The Han Dynasty in China tightly controlled salt production, fearing that private merchants might get too rich, too independent. In fact, some of the earliest smuggling cartels in recorded history were about salt. Not opium, not gold. Salt. Traders risked imprisonment, sometimes execution, to bypass imperial salt taxes. But what's interesting is how often women were used as intermediaries. In one region near the Sichuan salt wells, brothel owners acted as black market distributors. They hid salt under floorboards, passed it off as dowry gifts, and sent coded messages in love letters. One preserved message, addressed to my star-eyed warrior, includes this line: "I send you a pinch, not for your food, but for your courage." Poetic and criminal. Let's pause here for a second. Imagine your own body without salt. Your muscles twitch. Your nerves misfire. You can't sweat. You overheat. You hallucinate. Which means that every single person you meet on this trade route, every king, concubine, thief, scribe, is low-key addicted to the stuff. They crave it. They suffer when it's gone, and they'll trade almost anything to get it back. So no, salt isn't sexy in the way lace is sexy. It's sexy in the way oxygen is. Subtle, vital, taken for granted until it's gone. Which brings us to a strange sex story you won't find in most textbooks. In the court of Emperor Gaozu of the Tang dynasty, there was a consort named Zhu Mei, nicknamed the Salted Flower. She earned the name not for her cooking, but for her scent. According to one court diary, Zhu Mei regularly bathed in a mixture of rosewater and mineral salts brought from the Taklamakan Desert. The smell was said to be so intoxicating that diplomats would lose their train of thought in her presence. One official, famously stoic, fainted during an audience. She allegedly used her influence to sway salt taxes, directing trade through provinces that favored her brother's merchants. Some historians say this is apocryphal. Others say it's evidence of soft power at its most fragrant. Either way, she's become a legend, the woman who seduced an empire with nothing but salt and timing. Of course, not everyone used scent. In the arid salt markets of the Levant, sex workers carried tiny pouches of spice and sweat around their necks as memory bags. They called them. Each bag was stitched with the initials of a client and a sprig of whatever scent they wore. It was a primitive loyalty program. One traveler wrote that a woman in Jerusalem had 50 such bags and never charged the same price twice. Her rates were based on how much she missed the client or how much salt he brought. All this makes you wonder how many trade negotiations were really about goods and how many were about longing. A caravan arrives. A feast is thrown. Dancers perform. Wine flows. By midnight, promises are being whispered into half-lit rooms. Deals sealed not with signatures, but with a shared bed and salt rubbed onto the skin. You start to understand that love and trade aren't opposites. They're cousins. Both are about trust, risk, and the hope that what you're giving is worth what you're getting. And here's the irony. While the world was being mapped in salt lines and longing, the official records tried to keep it clean. They listed goods: 50 bolts of silk, 200 measures of pepper, 10 jars of rose oil. They didn't list the winks, the late-night laughter, the glances over veils. But those were there too. Always. So tonight, as your caravan crests another dune and the salt stars glimmer on the horizon, remember this. You're not just following a trail of trade. You're following a trail of touches, of moments exchanged, of invisible debts and unforgettable glances. The salt might preserve meat, but it also preserves memory. And memory, as we'll see, is one of the most valuable currencies of all. You're squatting in the dust, chewing on a piece of dried fig that tastes like regret, watching a group of traders argue over a bolt of silk and the price of a single night's company. One of them slaps a handful of silver on the table. Another offers a bag of saffron. The third, older, calmer, simply says a name, a woman's name, and the others go quiet. That's when you realize out here, in the wild throat of the trade routes, nothing speaks louder than reputation. And sometimes, the most valuable currency isn't spice or gold. It's a story whispered in the right ear about what someone once did in the dark. Welcome to the unlit side of the merchant road, the part that doesn't get drawn on maps because it doesn't travel in straight lines. It flows in glances, in songs hummed behind a veil, in the faint clink of jewelry against skin that's promised, temporarily, to someone just passing through. Caravanserais, those roadside inns that dot the length of the silk and spice roads, weren't just rest stops for weary legs and camels. They were marketplaces of desire, emotional vending machines dressed as hospitality. You step inside one, and the air changes. It smells like sweat, rosewater, and uncertainty. The rugs are threadbare, but inviting. The voices are low, but intense. You can't tell if people are arguing or flirting, or maybe both. Over in the corner, a man and a woman are laughing, except they don't speak the same language. She gestures with her hands. He answers with coins. Somehow, they understand each other perfectly. This is where things get slippery. Technically, these stops were for food and shelter. Realistically, they became ecosystems of improvisation. Spices were traded, camels watered, lies told, and yes, bodies rented. Not in the crude sense you might expect, but in the full theatrical range of what companionship meant. One traveler's journal from the 12th century describes an inn in Bukhara where the rooms were color-coded red for sleep, gold for gambling, violet for pleasure. He stayed in the violet one twice. Said it smelled like myrrh and secrets. Historians still debate whether these accounts were embellished, but the architectural evidence suggests specialized rooms did exist, and that they were designed for more than just rest. Sex wasn't just a distraction here, it was an asset. Something that could smooth tense negotiations or close a trade. There's a documented case of a silk merchant from Samarkand who refused to lower his prices until he spent an evening with a particular dancer. The next morning, he cut his prices in half and added 3 bonus bolts of fabric to the deal. When asked why, he reportedly said, "She reminded me of color. Make of that what you will." The point is, desire had market power, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp. And while we're here, let's peek behind one of those caravanserai doors. Imagine a flickering oil lamp, shadows painted on the walls, and a woman reclining on a pile of cushions. Her name might be Afsana. She doesn't ask your name, doesn't need it. She's heard your kind of voice before, tired, curious, half broken by the road. She pours a drink that tastes like burnt orange and honey, asks you about the cities you've seen, asks what you're running from. She smiles like she already knows the answer. Later, after the drink and the stories, she offers you a folded piece of cloth for your wife. She says, you don't have one. She knows, but you take the cloth anyway, because now it smells like her and like something you're going to miss. Who were these women? Not always sex workers in the way we think of them. Some were performers, some widows trying to survive. Some actual spies, placed by regional governors to listen, observe, report. And some were wives. Yes, actual wives of traders who traveled with their husbands and doubled as hospitality agents at the inns they stayed in. One 14th century Persian text describes a couple who ran a caravanserai where the wife was a singer, cook, and negotiator of nightly comfort. She even offered scented advice, which might be a euphemism, but might also mean she was literally selling perfume and pillow talk. Either way, Her presence was noted and paid for. Now here's a fringe fact that doesn't get enough love. The phrase market value in several Central Asian dialects originated not with commodities, but with bride prices. In other words, before you measured the worth of a bolt of silk, you first had to understand what a person was worth. It's a weird, sad calibration one that often placed beauty and youth above wisdom or strength. In one region, light eyes raised the price. In another, musical skill. In yet another, the ability to recite poetry backwards. It all depended on what the market craved and on who was passing through that week. Let's talk sex story. And this one's a scorcher by 13th century standards. Anyway, there's a tale in Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings that fits our setting perfectly. A minor ruler in Central Asia, whose name has been lost, but whose bed habits were apparently infamous, once offered free passage to any merchant who could entertain his mistress for a night while he was away. The catch: she was known to have an insatiable appetite for conversation mostly about horses and Mongol poetry. One weary trader agreed, hoping for a quiet evening and an easier tax. What followed was 10 hours of recitations, foot massages, and philosophical debates about the color blue. He got his passage, but when he arrived at his next stop, he was known as the man who tamed the wind. No one ever explained what that meant, but people nodded respectfully whenever they said it. This is the other part. No one tells you sex wasn't always physical. On the trade routes, intimacy often came in the form of shared silences, exchanged books, or nights spent watching each other sleep. Travelers were lonely. Languages clashed. And sometimes, just having someone sit beside you and pretend to understand was worth more than gold. This emotional economy, though harder to quantify, was just as real. A woman might spend an evening with a man who didn't touch her, but left behind a silk scarf soaked in his tears. She'd keep it, not out of sentiment, but because Sidness, Tua, had its uses. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated, twisted by retellings and male fantasy. Maybe. But the architecture remains. The journals survive. And the stories, retold in song and scent and proverb, refuse to die. That says something. That says everything. Here's your quirky tidbit in one medieval Turkish caravanserai. The local custom was to leave your shoes outside the door of your room unless you had company. In that case, you left one shoe inside and one outside, a secret code for occupied but friendly. Imagine walking past a row of doors and seeing one shoe in, one shoe out, like a dance, like a Morse code of desire, like a timeline of human needs, dangling casually outside someone's rented privacy. And so you walk on, past rows of flickering lanterns, past hushed rooms where love is being bought, borrowed, maybe faked. You think about how easily desire slides into commerce, how comfort gets priced, how laughter is rationed. You're not judging, you're learning. You're adjusting your sense of what matters in a world where home is a dream and warmth is temporary. By morning, you'll be back on the trail. But tonight, you carry a new kind of inventory, a memory of a violet room, the sound of coins on a wooden tray, a scarf that smells like rose water and firewood, a glance you weren't supposed to return but did, and somewhere in the corner of your mind, the haunting echo of a name you'll never say aloud, because naming it would make it real. And real things are always more expensive. The wind changes as you ride into the mountains. Cooler now, but not kind. It carries the sharp scent of pine mixed with smoke. Someone's cooking something rich and spiced, just out of sight. Probably goat. Maybe rabbit. Maybe something no one asks about. You pull your cloak tighter and glance at the ridgeline. Another border. Another language. Another set of rules about what's polite, what's sacred, and what's worth sleeping with. Because now you've entered the realm of royal diplomacy. And here, a kiss is never just a kiss. It's a treaty, a currency, a calculated risk in soft skin. Welcome to the world of naked diplomacy where gifts are wrapped in silk and sighs, and emissaries ride not just with parchments, but with concubines trained in the art of peacekeeping by seduction. Royal gift exchanges were rarely innocent. You show up at a foreign court with spices and gold. Sure, but you also bring dancers, singers, and the kind of courtesan who knows exactly when to pour more wine and when to suggest a walk in the garden. This was soft power at its finest. A well-placed consort could do more than 3 armies and 1,000 scrolls. There's a famous case, possibly apocryphal, definitely irresistible, of a Sogdian ambassador who delivered silk and 2 women to a Tang emperor. The women were sisters, reportedly trained in 6 languages and 6 dances. The emperor kept the silk, dismissed the ambassador, and married both sisters. Treaties were signed within the week. Later, when asked what the secret was, he allegedly said, "They laughed at my poetry, whether it's true or not." That quote has survived 13 centuries, because it rings true in a way that transcends paperwork. You're probably picturing this in your head like a romantic drama. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not all of these women were volunteers. Many were political hostages dressed as companions. The daughter of a defeated prince, sent with veils and jewels as an offering. The widow of a nobleman, gifted to secure trade. Historians still argue whether these exchanges empowered the women or erased them. But either way, their presence shifted the tone of diplomacy. A smile across the banquet table could unmake a war. A whispered joke could save a city. And it wasn't just women. In the Persian court, young men, often singers, poets, or athletes, were part of diplomatic entourages. Their role wasn't always spoken aloud, but it was understood. You might be asked to perform a song. You might be invited to a bathhouse. You might end the night in a room you didn't expect, translating affection into influence. In some cases, these individuals returned home with titles and new identities. In others, they simply vanished into the corridors of empire, absorbed by the very governments they'd been sent to flatter. Let's dig into a specific story. According to The Erotic Spirit Through History, there's a preserved letter from a 10th century Byzantine noblewoman to her counterpart in the Abbasid court. It's filled with formalities and metaphors. Our stars remain aligned across the moons, kind of thing. But in one paragraph, she mentions the gift of silk-clad grace you sent with your envoy. She writes, "He spoke no Greek, yet I understood him fully. His absence remains louder than any present. Scholars debate whether she's referring to a male dancer, a eunuch, or simply an unforgettable gesture. What we do know is that she added a rare blue dye to the next shipment of cloth, sent east, a diplomatic nod. A thank you, or maybe a flirtatious power play cloaked in trade. Meanwhile, behind palace doors, real negotiations happened not in throne rooms, but in bedrooms. In ancient Cambodia, royal envoys were known to entertain foreign wives with flattery and gossip, gently steering household opinion before ever speaking to the king. In Ethiopia, queens maintained their own gift registries and would often accept emissaries in private gardens, offering cool drinks and subtle warnings. And in Japan, it was common for a visiting dignitary to be presented with a performer who doubled as an informant. The pillow became both an archive and the spyglass. Information flowed best when the body relaxed, when egos softened into whispers. Here's your quirky tidbit in medieval Burma. A rare diplomatic gesture involved gifting a parrot trained to say flattering things about the recipient. One ambassador reportedly received a bird that chirped, "Your strength is like 10 elephants, and your voice like sweet rain." The parrot was kept in the guest's chamber, and yes, the rumor is that it repeated those lines during particularly private moments. Whether that made things more flattering or more awkward, we'll never know. The parrot, tragically, was stolen 2 weeks later, possibly by a jealous rival. Now, back to the soft candlelit corridors of empire. Picture a concubine learning languages in preparation for an international mission. She doesn't know where she's going yet, just that she's being trained in the culture, the cuisine, the art of laughing at jokes she doesn't find funny. She practices tilting her head just slightly while pouring wine, because it makes men feel seen. She's told her duty is national. Her body becomes geography. Her smile becomes policy. And when she finally arrives on horseback, with no name but her title, she's treated like a gift wrapped in velvet. She bows. She listens. She charms. And somewhere, a border softens. One famous example, the perfumed envoy of the Khmer Empire. A woman whose real name is lost, but whose impact was inked into Vietnamese and Thai court records alike. She wore layers of fabric soaked in crushed jasmine and orange blossom, which meant that even her absence lingered. She was said to walk so silently that only her scent arrived before her. Negotiations took place over 8 days, and trade routes were adjusted for decades based on her influence. Did she ever speak? No record says. But silences, as you've noticed by now, are often louder than speeches. And here's your sex story of the night, courtesy of Michel Foucault's Fragments. In the Abbasid era, one caliph received a royal gift from India, a twained courtesan who was said to never speak, only sing. Her voice, reportedly, could make men forget their names. The caliph was so intrigued, he met her alone. She sang once, touched his hand, and left. For the next week, he canceled all public events. When he finally reappeared, he introduced a new trade policy that favored Indian goods. The connection scholars still argue, but palace guards reported hearing music coming from his chamber every night for 7 nights straight. No lyrics, just that voice. You're starting to see the pattern. Across centuries and continents, power didn't just march, it danced. It whispered, it seduced. It used silk not just to wrap gifts, but to soften borders. And it carried faces, bodies, voices chosen not for brute force, but for their ability to disarm, distract, delight. This wasn't manipulation. This was an art form, a kind of diplomacy that couldn't be drafted, only performed. So as you ride out of the mountain pass, the scent of jasmine still clinging to your scarf, you understand something vital. The trade routes weren't just about goods. They were about grace, about gesture, about a glance across a banquet table that carried more risk than an entire army on the march. You look back once at the court you just left, its rooftops glowing gold in the fading light. You think about the envoy who brushed your sleeve when she passed, her fingers lingering just a second too long. You wonder what kind of treaty just got signed in the time it took for that contact to register. You smile. You don't look back again. You hear them before you see them, hooves on stone. The impatient clatter of expensive sandals. The soft hum of gossip in Latin. You've just crossed into the imperial belly of the Roman Empire, and it smells like ambition, olive oil, and something faintly burning, probably ego. Rome is loud, luxurious, and deeply insecure, especially about silk. And you, dear traveler, have just entered the moral panic of the century. Senators are weeping into their wine. Philosophers are losing sleep. And somewhere, an emperor is being scandalized by the idea of a woman's shoulder. Yes, just a shoulder. That's the power of silk. That's how wild things have gotten in the capital of discipline and conquest. Because the East has arrived and it's whisper-thin, dangerously sheer, and driving the West insane. Let's set the scene. It's the 1st century BCE, and Chinese silk has found its way to Rome. At first, it's a novelty soft, shimmering, strange. It slips through the fingers like water and clings like memory. Rich women start wrapping themselves in it. At first discreetly, then provocatively, then absolutely on purpose. And Roman men, famously confused by pleasure, immediately declare it a crisis. One senator stands up and claims that women in silk are basically naked in public. He calls it a threat to Roman virtue. How can we rule the world? He thunders, if our wives parade like Eastern harlots. That's a quote, more or less. Historians still argue whether these speeches were moral outrage or performance art. But either way, the message stuck: silk equals sin. Of course, this panic only made silk more popular, especially among the people who could afford to ignore the Senate. Gladiators' mistresses, poets' patrons, empresses with appetites they wore silk to provoke. They wore it at parties lit by torchlight, where it shimmered like a second skin. One empress, rumored to be Messalina, though sources are foggy, once hosted a banquet where every woman wore a different color of silk and no undergarments. A garden of temptation, one poet called it, before being exiled for treason, or possibly bad poetry. Hard to say. You stroll the forum and see it for yourself. Draped bodies, exposed collarbones, fabrics so light they flutter when someone breathes. It's not just fashion, it's a flex, a coded message that says I have money, access, and zero regard for your provincial anxieties. Silk isn't about warmth, it's about control. Control over attention, over narrative, over how much a single glance can cost. And it's not just women playing this game. Roman men start lining their tunics with silk. They claim it's for comfort. Sure, like pouring honey in your wine is for hydration. Let's talk about what made this scandalous. Silk, in its raw form, comes from silkworm cocoons. It's delicate, hard to produce, mysterious. The Chinese guarded its secrets like sacred law. No one outside China knew how it was made, not the Romans, not the Persians, not even the people who sold it secondhand. This added a kind of mystique to the fabric. It wasn't just soft, it was exotic, foreign, forbidden. Wearing it was a way of saying, I have something you'll never understand. That's powerful. And in Rome, where everything was about power, that made silk the ultimate statement piece. And now, your sex story for the evening one, that's slinky in all the right ways. According to Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, there was a Roman noblewoman named Sabina who was infamous for her silk collection. She had entire walls covered in the stuff, and her favorite game at parties was guess the color, played in a darkened room, with guests identifying silk shades by touch alone. Harmless enough, until one senator's wife was caught playing too enthusiastically. A scandal erupted. Letters were exchanged. Eventually, Sabina's husband was forced to donate her entire wardrobe to the Vestal Virgins for spiritual cleansing. The Vestals, reportedly, looked fantastic for weeks. This brings us to a bigger point. Desire is political. And in ancient Rome, the line between personal indulgence and public offense was razor thin. Emperors passed sumptuary laws to ban silk. These laws were often ignored or loopholed. One particularly clever aristocrat had her gowns woven with alternating stripes of silk and linen, technically legal, but still completely scandalous. She wore them to religious ceremonies. People fainted. The fabric shimmered like water on flesh. And suddenly, a prayer meeting became a negotiation of gaze and posture. Meanwhile, back in the shadows, the silk economy thrived. Smugglers carved new routes. Pirates rerouted shipments. Brokers in Antioch, Palmyra, and Alexandria grew rich on Eastern imports. Entire families rose in power just by knowing which road had the fewest customs officers. And of course, pleasure houses began specializing in silken rooms, private chambers where clients could pay to touch, wear, or be wrapped in imported silk. Some of these rooms even had silk bedding, which had to be changed nightly because, well, let's just say, things got dramatic. One brothel owner reportedly boasted that his rooms felt like the inside of a cloud and sounded like the inside of a poem. That man knew how to brand. Here's a fringe fact for you. In some Roman temples dedicated to Venus, worshippers offered silk as tribute. Not coins, not flowers. Silk. It was seen as the physical embodiment of desire, something foreign, rare, impossible to control. One inscription reads, "She wore the East on her skin and made the gods jealous." Archaeologists still debate whether these offerings were gifts or bribes, but either way, the implication is clear. Silk had become a stand-in for the sensual, the spiritual, and the socially subversive. And what about the men who brought it? The merchants, well, they weren't immune to the fabric's charms either. One particularly successful trader named Albius reportedly wrapped his entire bed in silk and refused to sleep on anything else. Wool itches, he explained. Before marrying a courtesan from Delphi and naming her Silkenia. Whether that was her real name or just excellent marketing is lost to time. But they did go on to sponsor 3 public baths and a small theater, all decorated with silk drapes and sensual murals. One of those murals, by the way, survives in fragmentary form and depicts 2 figures tangled in translucent fabric under a tree. No faces, just limbs and silk. The message, you decide. Historians still argue whether Rome's silk obsession was truly about fashion, or whether it masked deeper insecurities about the East, about wealth, about the slow rot of republican values. Some say silk corrupted Rome. Others say Rome was already corrupt, and silk just made it look prettier. What no one disputes is this, was. It left a mark, a slippery, shimmering, whispering mark. As you leave the city, the streets buzz behind you. You pass a market stall where silk hangs like captive rainbows. The vendor winks at you. The red one makes lovers braver, he says. The blue one makes them stay. You smile. You buy neither. You've seen enough for today. You've seen how fabric can become fichue, how touch becomes politics, how a simple thread from a distant worm can unravel a senate, seduce a poet, and turn a city into a performance of longing. You ride on. The sun sets behind the marble skyline, and somewhere, behind velvet curtains, someone is unwrapping a package that traveled thousands of miles, just to make one night feel unforgettable. Your boat rocks gently on the surface of the Indian Ocean, and for a moment, you're suspended between 2 worlds above. The stars ripple like spilled ink across a sheet of black silk. Below, the sea whispers secrets in the voices of 1,000 sunken deals. You breathe in salt, wood smoke, and something else, cardamom maybe, or musk, or the kind of perfume that lingers in your thoughts long after the source has vanished. Tonight, the water is calm, but trade on these waves was never smooth. It was wet, wild, and saturated with risk and desire. Because you're not just on a spice ship, you're on a floating brothel, monastery, and prison all rolled into one. Welcome to the Indian Ocean trade routes, where love gets bargained with the tide and lust travels faster than monsoons. The monsoon winds were everything here. They dictated the rhythm of commerce, the shape of ports, the flavor of stories. Traders had to wait months for the right winds, which meant being stuck in foreign lands with too much money and too much time. You can imagine what followed. Markets swelled with temporary residents. Docks became social laboratories, and the lines between guest and lover blurred under lantern light and coconut palms. In places like Calicut, Zanzibar, and Malacca, the ports weren't just trading hubs, they were social melting pots stirred by longing. Local women learned to speak Portuguese before they could read their own scripts. Indian sailors knew the scent of Arabic coffee better than their own mother's cooking. And every inn had a few rooms for the tide wives, the unofficial companions of seamen, who promised nothing but a warm night, and maybe a name. You step into one of these harbors, and everything hits you at once: the sizzle of cooking fish, the crack of palm wine bottles, the clang of ship repairs, and the laughter half genuine, half transactional. There's a group of women by the well, eyes coal dark, hands on hips, evaluating the new arrivals. One of them is singing, not a love song, a bargaining chant. The lyrics change with each customer. One verse is a price list, the next is a threat, the last is a joke about sailors who cry too easily. These aren't passive beauties waiting to be claimed. These are businesswomen, linguists, and sometimes prophets. One famous account from the Swahili coast tells of a woman named Salma who ran her own dockside empire. She spoke 5 languages, kept ledgers in palm leaf script, and handpicked which sailors could stay the night based on how they answered her riddles. Those who passed slept in perfumed hammocks. Those who failed sent back to their ships with a blistering insult and a handful of crushed cloves to sweeten their egos. But this wasn't just a world of women serving men. It went both ways. Buddhist monks often joined long-haul voyages to spread their faith. And sometimes, in the quieter corners of port cities, spiritual conversations morphed into something less chaste. One monk, according to Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, kept a diary in which he described a shimmering-eyed merchant whose nightly visits he initially resisted. Eventually, he wrote, "We meditated side by side, and the stillness between us grew warmer. I realized I had not taken a vow against compassion. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor or confession, but the language is delicate enough to feel like memory." And then there were the houses. The ones that looked like temples, but smelled like temptation. In ancient Sri Lanka, there existed a category of establishment called the flower house, technically tea lounges, unofficially places where pleasure was served with jasmine and political gossip. Each had a madam known as the Keeper of Petals, and these women were some of the most informed strategists on the trade route. Want to know if the Dutch were coming? Ask a flower house. Want to sway a vote in the local council? Send wine and 2 musicians to a petal keeper. Want to disappear? Pay double, wear white, and say nothing. And what about the sailors themselves, romanticized as rough, rugged, and ravenous? Yes, but many were more complex. One letter fragment found in the Maldives records a sailor writing to his tied wife. "I do not know when the wind will turn, but I left a ring in your pouch. If you wear it, I will find you again. If you sell it, I hope it buys you silk." It's not Shakespeare, but it's human. It's the kind of sentiment that sits between the transactional and the tender. The same way the sea sits between two shores, always reaching, never still. Let's slide into tonight's sex story, and it's soaked with salt and sin, according to Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, which was often referenced by traveling scholars and sailors alike. There was once a courtesan named Nayantara, who became so famous among merchant fleets that her name was painted on the hulls of at least 3 ships. Her specialty, memory. She could remember every client's name, what they liked, what they feared, and what scent they wore. She never repeated a story, never misremembered a face. One trader claimed she predicted a pirate raid in the middle of a kiss. Another swore she cured his seasickness with a particular song. Her fame grew so great that an East African port city offered her a lifetime tax exemption if she relocated. She refused. "My compass," she said, "only points to pleasure. And if that's not strange enough, here's your quirky tidbit in medieval Kerala. Sailors believed that burying a clove under their pillow before intimacy would prevent homesickness and nightmares. Some also believed that if a woman kept a dried ginger root in her hair during trade season, it would keep her lovers from lying. No one knows if it worked, but the herb sold out every monsoon. Of course, the presence of sex on these ships and in these ports didn't sit well with everyone. Islamic clerics in East Africa issued fatwas against unregistered marriages. Hindu priests warned against sea-borne lust. Buddhist preachers gave sermons about impermanence that doubled as veiled critiques of port-side entanglements. But the market didn't care. The demand didn't slow. If anything, the disapproval added spice. You wanted what you couldn't keep. You loved who you couldn't understand. You whispered promises you never intended to keep, and sometimes kept them anyway. Historians still argue whether these maritime romances were exploitative or empowering, whether the tied wives had agency or simply adjusted to survival. But if you listen to the oral histories, the poems, the jokes, the recipes passed down, you'll find women and men who remembered each other not with bitterness, but with something gentler. Regret, maybe, or pride, or a nostalgia so quiet it didn't need words. As your ship rocks toward its next port, and the sky turns the color of bruised mango, you think of the sailor who carved a woman's name into the mast, hoping the sea would carry it back to her. You think of the monk who meditated until desire softened his breath. You think of the flower houses, the petal keepers, the rooms soaked in clove smoke and half-truths. You understand now that the Indian Ocean wasn't just a corridor for pepper and pearls. It was a mirror, a liquid archive of the ways people reached for comfort in strange lands. A saltwater stage where desire performed in a dozen dialects. All of them temporary, all of them unforgettable. You ride into the desert at dusk, when the air turns to velvet and the sand glows with that impossible golden light, like the whole world is holding its breath. The caravan behind you stretches like a patient snake across the horizon, each camel swaying like it knows something you don't. Somewhere ahead, a city waits, fragrant and loud, tangled in incense smoke and argument. But for now, it's quiet. Only the creak of leather straps, the soft hiss of sand, and the distant ululation of some ritual you're not invited to. And then, like a secret blooming in the dusk, comes the rumor of her. A queen, a rebel, a woman who rides horses better than most men and commands troops with nothing but a lifted eyebrow. Zenobia. They whisper. Desert fire, lover of freedom, breaker of empires. And tonight, her name rolls through the sands like a promise and a warning. Zenobia of Palmyra was more than a queen. She was a disruption. A woman who refused to stay in her tent while men bartered her fate away. Her city, Palmyra, wasn't just a trade hub. It was the jewel of the desert, the nerve center of East-West exchange. Incense, ivory, silk, sex. It all passed through her streets. And under her rule, the city didn't just thrive, it dared to challenge Rome itself. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to what made her so unforgettable. It wasn't just the battles. It was the way she turned her own image into currency. She wore pearls like armor, gold filigree that looked delicate, but cut like knives. Her eyes, according to one source, were unreadable, like the shadows in a date grove. When she walked through the marketplace, even the camels knelt. And when Rome tried to send her a husband to tame her, Kishkoi laughed. Then married a general of her own choosing and took over his duties when he fell ill, which may be ancient euphemism for got in her way. Historians still debate whether she ruled beside him or instead of him. What's clear is that after his death, she didn't just mourn, she mobilized. Under Zenobia, Palmyra expanded like a hunger. She took Egypt, challenged Antioch, negotiated with Persia, all while hosting legendary parties that blended diplomacy, dance, and delight. Her palace was said to smell like frankincense and ambition. Visitors left dazed, clutching trade agreements they didn't remember signing. One Roman envoy wrote, "She speaks like a philosopher, eats like a soldier, and looks like something dreamed up in a tent on the fourth night of a dry march." His scroll was later censored, but copies survived because, of course, they did. Now let's talk about what really happened in those tented halls and palace courtyards. Because Zenobia knew how to use pleasure as strategy. She surrounded herself with women trained not just in song and dance, but in economics, law, and seduction. These weren't courtesans in the traditional sense, they were diplomats in disguise. One, named Samira, was known for her ability to get Roman generals to admit their troop numbers over a shared bowl of wine. Another, Ilithia, specialized in multilingual flattery that could diffuse any insult. There's even a record of a party where guests were assigned lovers based on their political leanings. Right-wing senators with left-leaning dancers, hawkish generals with pacifist poets. By morning, at least 3 alliances had softened. Tonight's sex story, it involves Zenobia herself. According to Peter Webb's collection of erotic histories, there's a tale of a midnight negotiation with a visiting prince from the Sassanid Empire. He expected a formal meeting. She sent wine. He expected scribes. She sent music. He expected a scroll. She arrived in person, barefoot, veiled in blue silk, and said, "Let's discuss terms with our hands first, then our tongues, then, if we must, with ink." The agreement they reached granted Palmyra exclusive trade rights for 3 years, and he never visited again. Not because he was angry, but because he couldn't trust himself not to give away more. You might think this sounds romanticized, exaggerated, dressed up in modern fantasy. Maybe. But the historical bones are there. Palmyra's wealth surged under her. Rome felt threatened. And when they finally came for her, it took the full military might of Aurelian. one of Rome's fiercest emperors, to bring her down. Even then, she surrendered in style, cloaked, defiant, on her own terms, paraded through Rome in golden chains. She held her head higher than her captors. That image, it survived. Artists painted it. Poets reimagined it. And today, she remains one of the few women in history whose defeat looks suspiciously like a final act of dominance. Here's your fringe fact. Zenobia may have spoken 5 languages fluently: Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Egyptian, and possibly Persian. This made her not just a ruler, but a translator between worlds. Some records say she personally reviewed trade contracts and corrected grammar. Others claim she could curse in 3 dialects and make it sound like a blessing. Either way, her words mattered. More than swords, more than ships. And what about the city she ruled? Palmyra was sensual in its very architecture, columns that soared like flirtations, arches that framed every entrance like an invitation, markets where silk brushed against bare arms, where spices perfumed the air with promise. Women walked unveiled. Men wore kohl. Gender was more flexible than most laws. And at night, the rooftop gardens came alive with songs, debates, and dances that lasted until the stars blinked away. It wasn't hedonism, it was performance, a calculated theater of prosperity that told visiting traders here, you will find pleasure and profit, and if you're lucky, a story no one back home will believe. Historians still argue whether Zenobia saw herself as a feminist icon, or simply a ruler doing what she had to. That debate says more about us than her. She didn't need a label. She needed results. And in a world where most women were currency, she became the mint, set her own rates, controlled the supply, devalued those who underestimated her. That's power. That's legacy. As you leave the ruins of Palmyra, half buried, half broken, yet still golden in the sunset, you can almost hear her laughter in the wind. Not cruel, not bitter, just amused, because she knew something most rulers never understand. People remember the conquerors, yes, but they desire the rebels. They crave the ones who dared to decorate power with perfume, who led armies in silk and hosted revolutions in song. You mount your camel, adjust your scarf, and for just a second, you wonder what kind of queen you might have been, if born in the right palace, or wrong tent, and whether your story would have ended in gold chains or written in incense and echoes, like hers. The desert gives way to jungle, and with it, the heat becomes thicker, no longer dry but sticky, like you're wading through someone else's breath. You walk down a winding road lined with banyan trees and half-whispered prayers, and suddenly the air is buzzing, not with insects, but with negotiation. Every whisper, every look, every rustle of silk is a deal waiting to happen. You've arrived at the spice road's most lucrative stops, but what they don't show on the map are the windows covered in gauze, the back rooms with incense burning low, and the faces painted in confidence and kohl. This isn't just a trade route, it's a sensory maze, a place where desire doesn't sneak through the shadows but sits right out front, cross-legged, counting coins and smiling like it already knows your weaknesses. You pass a banner advertising pleasures for the weary traveler written in 5 languages: Tamil, Arabic, Sanskrit, Chinese, Portuguese. It's clear this place doesn't judge who you are or where you're from. It only cares how much you're willing to pay for company, or conversation, or a moment of borrowed intimacy in the back of a sandalwood shop. You pause by a water cellar. He nods to you, then glances at the doorway beside his stall. No words, just the silent understanding that the most profitable commerce here doesn't wear price tags. You nod back, pretending not to know exactly what he meant. These pleasure houses weren't hidden. They were part of the infrastructure, like stables or wells. Some even paid taxes directly to local rulers, and others operated under temple protection, where sexuality was woven into ritual. You step into one, not out of lust, but curiosity. The floor is cool stone, the air rich with rose and turmeric, and the voices float like smoke from another world. There's a woman sitting by the entrance with a book in her lap. She's not reading it. She's waiting. You ask what's inside, and she replies, "Tonight's options." It's not a menu. It's a diary, one that changes every day depending on who walks through the door. Sex work along the Spice Road wasn't just tolerated, it was sometimes revered. In parts of South India, Devadasis women dedicated to temple service performed dances that were equal parts devotion and seduction. Trained from childhood in music, poetry, and politics, they entertained kings, swayed decisions, and sometimes dictated trade through nothing more than a series of winks and carefully choreographed hand gestures. A well-timed twirl could signal agreement. A flicked anklet could signal refusal. They knew how to use their presence the way others used weapons, but not all stories were elegant. Along the more rugged stretches of the trade routes, especially the borderlands where control shifted, weekly brothels became survival zones. One account from a Portuguese sailor in the 1500s describes an open-air market of bodies outside Cochin, where women sat beneath parasols and named their prices in clove, pepper, or dried fish. Some were indentured, some independent. All were navigating a world that priced beauty and punished need. According to him, one woman wore a chain of nutmeg shells as a necklace. "Each shell," she said, "is from a man who forgot my name, but not my price." Tonight's sex story comes from that same port, tucked inside an old logbook. A Tamil merchant wrote about a woman named Puvana, who ran a house near the docks and claimed to predict the success of any deal based on how a man kissed her hand. She never touched anyone else, just the hand. "Your mouth," she'd say, "knows what your gold lies about." One Dutch officer ignored her warning, made a large pepper purchase, and was robbed a week later by his own crew. He came back to her, furious. She just pointed to his palm and said, "You kissed like a thief, whether true or performance." She doubled her rates after that. Here's your fringe fact of the evening in parts of Southeast Asia. There existed a tradition of offering sexual hospitality as part of welcoming foreign traders. It wasn't considered prostitution, but diplomacy. Some families took pride in offering their daughters or sisters to important guests, not as submission, but as power projection. The implication being, we trust you with our beauty, so honor our terms. This practice, later demonized by colonial powers, was often misunderstood as exploitation. In truth, it functioned more like a contract one, where respect was mutual and breaking trust could lead to exile or worse. And this brings us to the politics, because nothing about sex in these places was simple. Pleasure was weaponized. Affection was bartered. Even jealousy had an exchange rate. In one city-state on the Malabar coast, a group of elite courtesans reportedly controlled access to certain trade councils. Not officially, of course, but many of the council members were their patrons. That meant pillow talk became policy. If they whispered that a Dutch captain had been disrespectful, his tax rates went up. If a Chinese trader gifted silks from Nanjing, he found his goods moved faster through customs. The most powerful woman in the city wasn't a queen or a priestess. She was a widow named Vanji, who reportedly owned 12 spice warehouses, 3 ships, and more than 100 secrets. She never remarried, never left her compound, but her name turned up in merchant letters from Amsterdam to Zanzibar. No portraits survive, only the stories. Historians still argue whether these women had true autonomy or operated within cages gilded by charisma. Some say they wielded power. Others say they were trapped in systems that smiled while squeezing. But if you listen closely to the oral stories passed through families, usually grandmothers, telling tales too spicy for fathers to hear, you get a different picture. One of women who chose, refused, manipulated, and laughed when they weren't supposed to. One poem from a 15th century Javanese collection says, "She touched his cheek like a coin on a scale testing for weight, not warmth." That line alone could have rewritten entire books on gender dynamics if it weren't tucked between verses about mangoes. And what about the men who bought affection? Not always cruel, not always weak. Some were simply lonely, displaced, stuck between ports, between promises. They came not just for skin, but for storytelling, for music, for someone to remember their name for an evening. One Chinese trader reportedly visited the same dancer every year for 10 years. He never slept with her, just watched her perform the same dance by lamplight while he drank spiced wine. When she died, he lit incense on his boat and wept for hours. His crew didn't mock him. They joined in, because they all had someone like that. Someone they didn't touch, but still felt. So you walk back into the night, the jungle pressing close, the stars now visible in slivers through the canopy. You carry the weight of all those unseen transactions. Not just the bodies traded or the kisses sold, but the choices, the laughter, the rules made and broken behind silk curtains and spice jars. And you understand something fundamental. This trade route didn't just move cloves and cinnamon. It moved confidence, moved comfort, moved the exact amount of illusion a person needed to feel whole again, even just for a night. You're standing at the edge of an imperial courtyard, and something's off. Not the marble still polished to a shine that could reflect regrets. Not the fountain still bubbling with fragrant water and illusion. No, it's the silence. Too perfect. Too curated. You're in China now, but not just anywhere. You're inside the vault of power, the forbidden city. And behind those silk-covered screens and gold-threaded doors lies a truth no one wants to admit. The economy of the empire doesn't just run on tea, porcelain, or dragon-branded silk. It runs on bodies, controlled ones, disguised ones, hidden behind titles like eunuch, virgin tribute, or courtesy concubine. And tonight, you're going to see how purity was weaponized into currency more precise than any minted coin. The first thing that hits you is the order. Everyone has a role. Everyone knows where they stand, or more accurately, where they kneel. But behind the ceremony, beneath the protocol, there's a market, a silent, glistening, excruciatingly well-managed market of desire, where the stakes are higher than pleasure. Here, a misplaced glance can cost you a future. A whispered word can turn into exile. And a single night in the Emperor's chamber, it could buy your family a generation of wealth, or send them all to the mines. Let's start with the vaults. Not the ones full of gold, but the ones guarded by silence. These are the rooms where eunuchs operate. Castrated as boys, they are trusted because they're supposedly immune to ambition of the flesh. That's the theory. In practice, many wielded more influence than generals. They controlled access to the emperor's private quarters. They arranged schedules for the concubines. They even decided which lovers got silk robes and which got rice. Some were kind, some were monsters. All were powerful. And in a world where touching the emperor could mean touching the divine, these men were gatekeepers to immortality. Now imagine this, a 14-year-old girl from a distant province, selected for her exceptional calmness and teeth like pearls, is brought to the palace as part of a tribute. She's called a virgin offering, a euphemism so sharp it cuts through ceremony. She's not a slave. Technically, she's a gift, a symbol of alliance, a human seal on a regional deal. Historians still debate whether these girls were always used sexually or simply paraded as ornaments. But we know this once accepted. They never returned home. They were given new names, new clothes, new futures, entirely dependent on how well they played a role they didn't audition for. And not all had the emperor's attention. In a palace of hundreds, most concubines never saw him. They aged waiting. They whispered. They formed alliances, rivalries, support systems. Some turned to religion, others to poetry. One woman, Lady Liu, was said to have carved her autobiography into the lacquer underside of her vanity chest. When her room was later ransacked during a fire, her story was preserved charred, but legible. In it, she wrote, "I came here with a name. Now I am a room. I exist when opened." Here's your sex story. And it's not pretty, but it's real. According to Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, one Ming emperor was so paranoid about infidelity that he only allowed his concubines to approach him after being inspected by 5 eunuchs and bathed in specially blessed water. One night, a woman arrived smelling like peony oil and unsanctioned scent. She was turned away, humiliated, then sent to the cold palace, a euphemism for the isolation wing. She never reappeared in records, but a eunuch's diary notes, cryptically, she smelled of rebellion. And the eunuchs, for all their supposed detachment, many had networks, lovers, secret pacts. Some were born into it. Others chose it voluntarily, underwent castration in the hope of palace access. The reward influence, wealth, safety, of a kind. There's a famous case of a eunuch named Wei Zhongxian, who essentially ruled the empire from behind a curtain for over a decade. He decided which tributes were accepted, which lovers were promoted, and which officials were reassigned. His downfall was swift and brutal. But during his reign, he was referred to quietly as the man who fathered nothing and owned everything. Here's your quirky tidbit in Imperial China. Virginity wasn't just prized. It was medically theorized to transfer vitality. Some emperors believed that sleeping with virgins extended their life force. This belief, rooted in Taoist alchemy, led to increasingly absurd practices like drinking dew collected from a concubine's skin at dawn or timing intimacy with lunar phases. One manual suggested the emperor breathe in the fragrance of youth before touching flesh, to absorb purity through the nostrils. If you're wondering how much of this worked, spoiler, not much. But the rituals flourished anyway, because desire loves a costume. And let's not forget the staging. These weren't casual encounters. They were performances. Rooms were decorated with specific scents, depending on the concubine's assigned persona: lotus for innocence, sandalwood for wisdom, plum blossom for sorrow. Some women were dressed in colors designed to match the emperor's dreams, as interpreted by court astrologers. One scholar wrote, he dreamt of a crane, so she wore gray and walked slowly. Whether it worked or not didn't matter. The performance was the point, but this wasn't all tragedy and control. Some women rose, One of the most famous, Wu Zetian, began as a low-ranking concubine and eventually became the only woman to officially rule China as emperor. Her rise was calculated, bold, and controversial, but undeniably brilliant. She mastered palace politics, seduced power, and used the court's obsession with feminine mystique to dismantle its own rules. She once said, "A woman's softness can bend an empire, but only if she remembers to sharpen it first." Chilling, and also kind of badass. Historians still argue whether these palace women were prisoners or politicians, victims or strategists. But maybe it's both. Maybe the real story is in how they carved out influence from within a system built to erase them. A soft voice overheard through a screen, a poem left under a pillow, a perfume that lingered on a robe long after the body was gone. These weren't accidents. They were tactics. As you step back from the courtyard, the silence hums louder now, like it's hiding something behind every brick. You realize that this place, this fortress of etiquette and oppression, isn't dead. It's just encoded. Every corridor is a story. Every locked door, a negotiation. And the women and eunuchs who lived here didn't just survive. They memorized the system so well they rewrote it from within. One glance at a passing servant, one tilt of a painted wrist, and suddenly a trade deal between provinces tilts, just slightly, in a new direction. So you walk away with the scent of lotus and sandalwood in your hair, and you think about how many empires claimed to worship purity, only to exploit it for power. How many palaces declared their women sacred, then sold their stories for silence, and how many secrets still sleep beneath silk sheets forgotten by kings, remembered only by those who were told to be quiet and smiled anyway. You hear it before you see it, the lapping of water against stone, the creak of gondolas in the dark, the low murmur of voices hidden behind masks. The air smells like algae and ambition, laced with smoke from lanterns and secrets. You've arrived in Venice, the place where East meets West, not in deserts or palaces, but in courtyards of illusion. Here, the silk that once clung to emperors now slips through the hands of merchants and mistresses. Here, seduction is a civic duty. Masks are worn as second skins, and fantasies aren't whispered, they're bought, sold, and resold until no one remembers where they began. This isn't just a port city. It's a theater. And every canal reflects a truth no one wants to say out loud. Trade didn't just move goods, it moved longing. It ferried the dreams of 1,000 tired men and dressed them in silk for a night they'd pay to forget. The Venetians didn't just trade in silks, they traded in stories. They sold the East not as it was, but as they wanted it to be. Exotic, sensual, dangerous. They painted it into murals, stitched it into gowns, wove it into perfume. You walk past shop windows glittering with Turkish slippers, Chinese fans, Arabic glass. But they're all copies, echoes of the original, passed through so many hands, they've lost their voice. That's the Venetian trick. Make desire just unfamiliar enough to feel thrilling, but still safe enough to own. The East became a fantasy because it had to be. No empire survives without something to crave, and nothing sells better than the impossible. And nothing fuels that fantasy like silk. It's everywhere here, draped over balconies, slinking through alleyways, trailing behind women who look like they might belong in harem tales, but are actually just clever daughters of bankers. They wear silk like armor, like bait, like prophecy. The city's obsession with the fabric was more than fashion, it was identity. If Rome feared silk as a threat to morals, Venice turned it into a symbol of mastery. They couldn't conquer the East, so they outstyled it. And in doing so, they invented a new economy, the eroticized aesthetic of elsewhere. Let's slip behind one of those curtained windows now. Shall we? There's a woman, let's call her Allegra, lounging on a velvet divan, her hair arranged with pearls, her laughter timed like a metronome of seduction. She's not a courtesan in the crude sense. She's a cortegiana onesta, a high-class courtesan, educated, witty, multilingual. She's read more books than her clients and corrects their grammar mid-kiss. She chooses her visitors like a queen issuing summons. And she, too, traffics in silk. Her gowns are imported, embroidered, blessed. But the real silk is in her words, smooth, shimmering, layered. A merchant once offered her a house in Padua for a single night. She declined. "I already have a view," she said, "and better company." The house was later donated to a monastery, but her ghost still walks the halls, probably editing the monk's sermons. Tonight's sex story, one of the juiciest. In the 16th century, a Venetian ambassador returned from Constantinople with a journal of erotic tales, allegedly gifts from an Ottoman concubine he never touched. He claimed she sent him daily scrolls describing her dreams, fantasies, and palace gossip. These scrolls, bound in blue silk and sealed with wax perfumed with jasmine, became famous among Venetian elites. Copies circulated like forbidden candy. One scroll described an invisible lover who only arrived when the moon was full and left gold coins on her pillow. Scholars debate whether she was real or a literary invention, or perhaps a clever spy feeding intel in the form of erotica. Either way, the scrolls launched 1,000 daydreams and more than a few business ventures. Here's your quirky tidbit. Venetian silk guilds once banned tailors from selling excessively sensual robes to unmarried women unless they could prove their dowries were secured. The idea was to prevent temptation through textiles, but enforcement was, well, inconsistent. One record from the Doge's court shows a fine issued to a tailor for fabricating fantasies of the flesh. His defense: "My thread cannot predict sin." The court, unimpressed, fined him and secretly commissioned matching robes for their mistresses. This is the core of it. Venice wanted to control the fantasy while pretending it didn't participate. Behind the carnival masks, everyone was pretending not to care, pretending not to want, pretending that silk was just fabric and not a metaphor for everything they feared about desire. And when East met West in this city of illusions, it wasn't a clash. It was a performance. The merchant from Aleppo met the painter from Murano, met the dancer from Cairo, met the spy dressed as a seamstress, and no one asked too many questions. Trade here was never neutral. Every transaction carried suggestion. A bolt of silk might carry a coded message. A vial of perfume might mask the scent of betrayal. A pearl necklace might be payment or apology. Historians still argue whether Venice exported more cloth or more narrative. And maybe that's the point. The goods were just the visible half. The real commerce happened in imagination. The courtesans knew this. So did the merchants. Even the clergy played along, penning moral condemnations in the morning and ordering Turkish rugs by evening. One bishop famously warned his congregation against the sinful softness of Eastern imports while wearing a robe so sheer it was mistaken for fog. A satirical pamphlet at the time asked, "Which silk blinds the soul faster, the one worn or the one whispered about?" But it wasn't just about seduction. Venice used its eroticized identity as a political tool. Ambassadors were chosen for charm as much as for strategy. One envoy to Persia was instructed to speak with velvet, not volume. When a trade deal failed, it was often followed by a cultural delegation of dancers and musicians, accompanied by ladies of learning who just happened to speak Persian and know all the right flattery. These women weren't just decoration. They were data collectors, soft spies, emotionally fluent operatives who could uncover more in an hour of small talk than a week of interrogation. And still, for all of the power they held, their names rarely made it into ledgers. They were remembered in songs, in rumors, in perfumes named after them. One especially famous fragrance, Fiamma, was said to be inspired by a woman who once seduced both a Venetian captain and a Turkish prince on the same night, at the same masquerade. Whether it happened or not doesn't matter. The perfume sold out for decades. The story became a brand. So you step back into the alleyways, the moonlight painting canals with silver ribbons, and you feel the silk around you not just in the clothes or the cushions, but in the way the city moves. Smooth, complicated, always shifting. You realize that Venice wasn't just a waypoint. It was a mirror, a place that didn't just sell the East to the West, it sold the West back to itself, wrapped in fantasy and scented with longing. And as your gondola slips away from the dock, and the city recedes behind veils of fog, you wonder how much of what we call history is just silk. Draped over desire, the hoofbeats come before dawn, pounding the dirt with a rhythm that wakes you from dreams you weren't ready to leave. You rub your eyes and squint into the dust, and there they are, riders, dozens of them, charging across the plains with satchels flapping and arrows glinting at their hips. No banners, no greetings, just speed. You've entered Mongol territory now, where messages outrun armies and pleasure is measured in pragmatic bursts. The Mongol Empire wasn't just a war machine, it was a communication network, a geopolitical artery, a fast-moving pulse of conquest and craving. And right in the center of it all, a relay system so effective it makes your modern email look like smoke signals. But what no one told you is that those messengers weren't just delivering state secrets, they were also delivering themselves. And sometimes, wives. You crouch by the roadside as one of the riders slows just enough to toss a pouch of dried meat to a waiting hostler. He doesn't dismount, doesn't speak. He's already galloping again, heading toward the next yam. Those way stations spaced a day's ride apart, stocked with fresh horses, hot meals, and, occasionally, warm bodies. The Mongol postal system was the envy of the world, but it wasn't just logistics that made it legendary. It was the way it blurred the line between messenger and meaning, between journey and indulgence, along the Yam network. What moved fastest wasn't just information, it was intimacy. These way stations weren't just pit stops. They were social zones. In some, wives of local chieftains would welcome riders with food, bath water, and sometimes more. It wasn't official policy, of course, but when you've ridden 150 miles in a single day across a frozen steppe, and someone offers you soup, a smile, and a skin of fermented mare's milk, you don't ask questions. You follow the scent of stewed onions and oiled hair into a tent that smells like felt, and something older, something feral. Inside, you might find a woman named Borte, who's been running this station since her husband died last winter. She knows every rider by scent, keeps track of which ones cry in their sleep, and which ones leave a carved token under her mat after a night together. She never asks why. She only remembers. That's her power. The memory of moments that never made it into the annals of empire, but still mattered more than decrees. She knows that some men don't want comfort, only to be seen. Others want silence. A few want stories. She gives them all exactly what they ask for, even when they don't know how to ask. Let's talk about the Mongols and marriage. It wasn't quite what you expect. Polygamy was common. Yes, but not chaotic. Genghis Khan himself had multiple wives, but only one empress. Borta, his first and most politically influential. The other wives were often alliances' gifts, hostages, or tokens of diplomacy. And yet, there's something strangely egalitarian in the arrangement. Wives had their own tents, land, sometimes their own soldiers. Some ran courts within courts, handling internal affairs and, at times, managing diplomatic correspondence. One of Genghis Khan's daughters, Alakai Beki, was given control of her own territory and wielded significant military command. Her rule was so effective that when she died, local leaders wore mourning garb and halted trade in her honor. Not because she was beautiful, but because she was strategic. And here's your sex story. It's less scandal, more power play. During the reign of Ugadei Khan, one of the way stations hosted a legendary feast where a Persian envoy met a Mongol noblewoman named Temujin. She wasn't a consort. She was an administrator, stationed there to oversee logistics. She spoke Persian, Turkish, and Mongolic. During the meal, the envoy reportedly made a clumsy attempt at flirtation. She responded by outlining the correct ratio of horse to rider required to traverse the Gobi in spring. He fell in love immediately. They spent one night together. By morning, he'd agreed to lower his state's transit tax by half. In his diary, he wrote, "Her arithmetic was more precise than her perfume." That quote still painted on the inner wall of one surviving station ruin in eastern Kazakhstan. Here's your quirky tidbit. Mongol messengers called uruds were sometimes required to carry a small carved idol in their saddlebags. Not for religion, for negotiation. The idol served as a diplomatic bluff token, which could be used to enter certain camps or secure temporary shelter. Some messengers would carve initials into them. A few, according to oral legend, hid love notes inside hollowed ones. One such note, found in a stash buried beneath a yam site, reads simply, "I rode fast, but not away from you." And while men rode hard, women held the tent lines. There's this forgotten term, diplomacy, referring to negotiations conducted not in formal halls, but inside yurts, often between the wives of rival clans. While their husbands raided or traded, the women talked, shared fermented milk, told stories laced with intent. In one tale, two rival queens, Mongol and Uyghur, settled a dispute by exchanging braided locks of hair and promises sealed with wine. Whether symbolic or sacred, the peace lasted for years. No contracts, just trust braided into memory. Historians still argue whether the Mongol Empire's women had real power or simply survived in the shadows of men. But surviving here was power, thriving, even more so. When you build your empire on motion, your only constant is who you sleep beside. And if that person helps you decode a border map or choose the right tributary envoy, then what you shared wasn't weakness, it was intelligence gathering. Sex wasn't romanticized here. It was physical, logistical, and sometimes tender in a brutal way. Riders spent months in isolation. Their bodies ached. Their minds spun with duty and fatigue. And when they reached a yam and found someone who didn't ask for stories but offered warmth anyway, that was a form of currency no scribe ever recorded. Yet it was traded daily. And what about the silk? Even here, in the leather-heavy, fur-lined sprawl of the Mongol Empire, silk found its way into beds. Sometimes it lined a saddlebag. Other times, it was gifted by grateful envoys. A woman in a remote way station might wear it for one night, only just to remind herself that beauty wasn't always distant. That comfort could arrive, if only briefly, on the back of a dust-covered horse, as you watch another rider vanish into the horizon, his silhouette swallowed by morning light. You realize the genius of this empire. It wasn't just fast. It was flexible. It understood that power isn't only held by swords or scrolls, but in soft spaces, quiet hands, and the eyes of someone who asks, "How far have you come?" and listens to the answer like it matters. You're standing in a narrow street that smells like roasted almonds, damp parchment, and a hint of regret. Lanterns flicker on iron hooks above your head, casting a golden sheen on cobblestones slick from a recent rain. Somewhere behind you, someone laughs too loud. Up ahead, a door creaks open and the unmistakable scent of musk, citrus, and desperation wafts out. You've wandered into one of the stranger corners of medieval commerce where lust was taxed, perfume was currency, and governments tallied orgasms on ledgers. This isn't some bawdy tale from the back pages. This is the regulated, audited, and often deeply weird world of medieval sex economies. Welcome to the era of sex taxes and perfume bribes, where your bedroom habits might fund a city wall or a bishop's vacation home. Let's start with France, because of course, in Paris, during the 13th century, brothels weren't just tolerated, they were licensed, legal, counted. The city taxed sex workers, categorized their establishments, and even issued fines if they wore the wrong color belts. Yes, belts. There was an official color code: crimson for high status, blue for mid-tier, brown for entry level. Get it wrong. And you were fined not for indecency, but for disrupting the illusion of order. The entire system was designed like a civic utility. Need a bathhouse, a bakery, a bit of company. All three were available on Rue Gravois. If you had the coin and weren't afraid of judgmental cats on the windowsills. But it wasn't just about control. Cities profited. In Avignon, a portion of brothel taxes was earmarked for bridge repair. In Marseille, funds went toward harbor maintenance. One ledger from Toulouse lists funds collected from the House of Four Pillows next to repair of western gate hinges. That gate probably opened more times than it closed. Historians still argue whether this legitimized exploitation or provided safety through regulation. What's clear is that cities knew the value of desire and didn't waste it. Now, enter the perfumers. You'd think perfumers just sold scent. But in cities like Florence and Fez, they were unofficial therapists, social brokers, and sometimes smugglers. One 15th century perfumer named Gaspard was arrested not for illegal sales, but for smuggling love letters inside perfume bottles. He claimed it was a delivery of emotional aid. The magistrate laughed, confiscated the bottle, and passed it around the courtroom. The scent bergamot, pine, and loss. Perfume became one of the most discreet forms of sexual diplomacy. A noblewoman couldn't be seen writing to a former lover, but she could send him a scented glove. A courtesan couldn't publicly admit affection, but she could switch fragrances wearing jasmine for longing, myrrh for anger, rose for forgiveness. There's even a preserved recipe in a Venetian apothecary's journal titled, "For Softening a Hardened Heart." Ingredients: orange blossom, crushed pearls, clove oil, and a single tear, dried on linen. That last bit probably theatrical, possibly real. And speaking of theatrical, let's not skip over England, where the crown took its own cut of carnal commerce. In London, sex workers operating within the bishop-controlled liberty of the clink paid fees directly to church officials. The church, in turn, recorded these under a hilariously ironic name, penitential tithes. You'd sleep with someone, then pay God's accountant. It was sin with a receipt. One bishop famously tried to outlaw perfume in these establishments, claiming it confused the senses and invited wickedness. The next year, perfume sales tripled. His own servants were caught smuggling sandalwood oil to a brothel near the docks. Tonight's sex story isn't scandal, it's satire. A well-documented account from the archives of Bruges tells of a woman named Jacqueline, a tax collector's mistress who negotiated lower levies for local brothels in exchange for free room and board. She allegedly wrote her own tax codes in verse for every kiss that's sweet and fast, a coin for church to hold you fast. The local priest objected. She seduced him. The objection was withdrawn. Her poems survive in marginalia beside legal texts, legalized flirtation, scribbled in the margins of morality. And now, your quirky tidbit. In the city of Fez, certain perfume blends were so linked to sexual connotation that shopkeepers used coded names. Sultan's breath meant desire. The late widow meant sorrowful seduction. And one blend, Caravan's End, was rumored to cause prophetic dreams. A traveling merchant from Samarkand once wrote that after smelling it, he dreamt of a woman in blue telling him to leave the spice trade and take up poetry. He did. His poems were awful, but his perfume shop thrived. Let's talk economics. Sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was part of urban planning. Some cities had entire districts designed to isolate, attract, and monetize vice. In Hamburg, brothel windows faced the river so sailors could choose company from the deck. In Milan, inspectors ensured brothels had enough candles and clean linens, not for morality, but to keep disease down and revenue up. And in Cairo, love poems were posted on public walls near brothels, some attributed to customers, others to the women themselves. A favorite. He came to me with coins and questions. I gave him answers worth more than both. Historians still argue whether these regulated zones protected women or institutionalized their marginalization. Some say women gained financial independence. Others call it gilded servitude. But listen to the voices left behind the scribbled notes, the perfume receipts, the songs sung in bathhouses, and you hear nuance. These weren't silent victims. They were negotiators, artists, survivors. One woman in Naples is recorded as charging double for clients who spoke in metaphors. "If you want poetry," she said, "you'll pay in gold." And then there's the tax logic itself. In medieval Cologne, couples caught having sex outside marriage could avoid punishment by paying a fine of longing. The more passionate the act, as judged by neighbors or arresting guards, the higher the fee. This led to a strange public performance of guilt, people exaggerating contrition to get reduced rates. Some churches offered penance packages, confession plus a scented candle and a voucher for next month. Redemption, prepaid. As you walk past another corner, a woman leans out of a window and sprinkles something into the air. It smells like vanilla and risk. A man below pauses, touches his chest, and walks away without a word. No coin exchanged, no contract. Just scent. Just memory. You realize this wasn't a world of dirty alleys and moral collapse. It was a spreadsheet world. A scented one. A place where desire was counted, capped, and often copied. Where sex wasn't shame, it was strategy. Where perfume was protest. where moans were taxed. But laughter was free, so you step into a small tavern at the edge of the district. A scroll nailed to the wall lists tonight's specials: wine, stew, and stories too soft to shout. A bowl of cloves sits on the table. A server with eyes lined in charcoal asks if you've come to pay or to confess. You smile and say, whichever's cheaper. She laughs and lights a candle. And somewhere, on a parchment no one will read for centuries, a scribe notes your visit not by name, but by scent. It's the quiet that gets you first. Not silence, just the kind of careful quiet that feels choreographed. Footsteps glide, not stomp. Voices linger, but never rise. Even the fountains seem to whisper. You're deep inside the Ottoman palace now, where walls hold more secrets than libraries, and every breeze smells faintly of rosewater, sweat, and conspiracy. You pass through arched doorways into a world layered with silk, shadow, and suggestion. You're in the harem, and here, behind embroidered curtains and intricately tiled corridors, love isn't romantic, it's strategic. It's perfumed espionage, a soft war waged in coal and choreography. This isn't some erotic fantasy, it's one of the most tightly controlled power centers in the empire. And tonight, you're walking straight into the lioness's den. Forget the cliches. The harem wasn't just a sensual playground, it was a factory of influence. It was where women, many of them enslaved or taken as tribute, learned to navigate court life, language politics, and the emotional triggers of emperors. At its height, the Topkapi Palace harem in Istanbul housed over 300 women, not a single one of them idle. They studied poetry, theology, diplomacy. They performed music not just for entertainment, but as veiled messaging. They danced to send signals. A lifted eyebrow meant be cautious. A misstep meant he's listening. You're led by a eunuch, dressed in black silk, his gaze sharp, his voice barely louder than the rustle of a curtain. You enter a large chamber glowing with oil lamps and heavy with scent jasmine. Musk, something spiced you can't quite place. This is where the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, holds court. She's not lounging. She's not giggling. She's negotiating military appointments and reviewing provincial reports. Around her, concubines listen, learn. Some will be lovers. Some will be spies. Some will write letters that change the fate of cities. Let's talk about her, the Valid Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. She controlled who saw the Sultan, what messages he received, and which of his lovers got his ear at night. One of the most infamous was Qasem Sultan, who ruled for decades from behind a screen. She orchestrated assassinations, arranged marriages, and reportedly wore perfume so strong that entering her chambers was considered an act of surrender. Men fell to their knees not from lust, but from fear. She once told an ambassador, "My son sits on the throne, but I hold the incense." And yet, within this gilded maze, desire still found its way. Among the concubines, affection bloomed in stolen glances, shared poems, the briefest brush of fingers during a shared dance rehearsal. A story recorded in the Harem Chronicles speaks of Aisha, a Persian girl who came to the palace at 13 and became the preferred storyteller among the inner circle. Her tales were laced with innuendo, sharp political satire, and heartbreak. One, titled "The Candle's Jealousy," was about a flame that refused to go out, even after it burned everything around it. It was banned. She was promoted. Later, she became the Sultan's favorite, not because of her looks, but because she made him laugh in ways his viziers could not. tonight's sex story, then, is about her. Aisha's diary, later found hidden in a quilt, describes a night not of seduction, but survival. The Sultan had been grieving, unreachable. The court was restless. She sent him a scarf scented with a rare Turkish rose and wrote just 3 words: "Your sorrow stings." That night, he called for her. They did not make love. They lay back to back, silent, her hand on his. I touched a vein of sadness. She wrote, and it bled into trust. By morning, she had become untouchable, not a lover, but a balm. Here's your quirky tidbit within the harem. Rival concubines would sometimes use scent offensively. A bath infused with bitter orange was rumored to induce melancholy. Cinnamon, if overused, could cause irritation, physical and emotional. One concubine was exiled after being caught tampering with another's rose oil, replacing it with myrrh and fox musk. The investigation took 2 weeks and involved 3 astrologers, 2 perfumers, and a poet. The poet sided with the fox musk. Even the architecture aided the intrigue. Corridors curved intentionally to muffle sound. Screens were positioned to allow viewing without being seen. Secret staircases connected the Sultan's chambers to private gardens, where unofficial meetings, both political and sensual, took place. Historians still debate whether one rumored moon pavilion existed, where the Sultan supposedly met with an unnamed concubine who spoke only in riddles. A record mentions her once, the one who vanished like scent after a storm. No other trace remains. The harem's power wasn't just in its access to the Sultan. It was in its ability to control the emotional atmosphere of the empire. If the Sultan was distracted, angry, euphoric, the whole court felt it. The Valide knew this. She curated moods. A particular melody played to lower his blood pressure. A certain concubine assigned to speak softly when tension brewed. In many ways, the harem was emotional espionage, disguised as pleasure. The empire didn't just run on taxes and armies. It ran on perfume and prediction. And let's not pretend this was just for men. The women within the harem formed bonds, rivalries, love affairs. Some letters between concubines hint at deep intimacy, though the language is coded. One famous passage reads, "When she brushed my hair, I forgot my own name. When she sang, I remembered why I stayed." Modern historians parse these with caution, but the emotional weight is hard to ignore. Outside the palace, the harem's influence seeped into society. Fashion mimicked its styles. Markets sold knockoff perfumes named after favorites. One blend, Shadowed Garden, was so popular that European diplomats smuggled it home, mistaking it for an aphrodisiac. It wasn't. It just smelled like power, earthy, floral, laced with something you couldn't quite describe, but couldn't stop thinking about. Historians still argue whether the harem was a prison or a platform, a cage or a kingdom. But maybe it was both. Maybe that's why it worked. The women inside learned to navigate impossibility to find agency in performance, strategy in seduction, and influence in softness. They were poets, puppeteers, politicians, and occasionally, lovers. You leave the chamber and walk the outer gardens, where the air is cooler and quieter. But even here, the scent lingers, not strong, not cloying, just enough to make you turn your head, as if someone's watching. You realize that in this empire, nothing is accidental. Not the rustle of silk, not the placement of a mirror, not the decision to love someone who could destroy you. And somewhere, back inside those mosaic halls, a girl sharpens her wit like a blade, dips her scarf in clove oil, and prepares to enter the room where futures are chosen by candlelight and memory. The world shifts again. You step off a boat and into a dream, one stitched in gold thread and cherry blossoms. The air smells impossibly clean, but also sweet, like the aftermath of a secret shared in spring. You've arrived in Japan, not just geographically, but culturally, and not the Japan of samurai duels and solemn tea. This is the floating world, ukiyo, a place designed not for permanence, but for beauty that flickers and fades. Here, seduction is an art form, and every detail from the curve of a painted fan to the silk of a kimono sleeve is curated with obsessive care. This is the world of courtesans, where silk doesn't just cover the body, it scripts a performance. And love isn't spontaneous, it's staged, refined, rehearsed, and sold like lacquered poetry. You're in Edo, walking through Yoshiwara, the city's licensed pleasure district. The streets are narrow, lantern-lit, echoing with the rhythmic clack of wooden geta sandals and the teasing cadence of a shamisen played behind a screen. You pass the entrance gates, formidable, yet theatrical, and suddenly, the air shifts. People move differently here, slower, more deliberate. Because Yoshiwara isn't about urgency, it's about anticipation, about cultivating desire with such elegance that by the time your fingers touch, the touch itself is almost redundant. You've already been seduced by the architecture. Inside, a procession moves past Oiran, the highest-ranking courtesans, parading in ornate layers of kimono so heavy they need assistance to help them walk. Their hair is an elaborate construction of pins, lacquer, and scent. Their expressions, controlled, blank, inviting only those who've paid the price emotionally, financially, and socially. These women aren't prostitutes in the Western sense. They're entertainers, intellectuals, artists. They perform seduction the way a no actor performs grief with stylized precision and the full weight of tradition behind every glance. Let's talk about that glance. In the floating world, eye contact was calculated. A quick dart meant shyness. A prolonged look over the rim of a sake cup meant challenge. A glance followed by a slow blink that was practically a contract. Courtesans trained for years in this visual language. They learned poetry, calligraphy, politics. Many could quote Chinese classics, debate Zen philosophy, and compose songs about the moon that made grown men weep. A client didn't just buy time. He bought access to a universe curated around his fantasy and constructed with the elegance of 1,000 crushed camellia petals. And yet, within this elegance, there was exhaustion. Courtesans often began training as young girls, sold by families too poor to survive another season. They worked under strict contracts, some lasting a decade or more, before they could earn freedom. Their lives were performances layered in performance. Even their moments of rest were stylized. A nap posed under a plum blossom. A bath taken with ceremonial oils. The line between self and stage blurred until many no longer knew where it was. Tonight's sex story. It's one of yearning and rebellion. A well-documented case from the 18th century tells of a courtesan named Takao, whose beauty was said to turn maps to ink and memory to silk. She was famed for refusing powerful clients, daimyos, merchants, even the brother of the shogun. And then came Hanzo, a poet with no money and too much honesty. He sent her a single poem: "I cannot afford your time, so I write in the margins of my hunger." She refused him, then called for him, then saw him nightly, in secret, for over a year. When her brothel found out, they beat her and doubled her fees. She refused to take another client. Eventually, she died of illness or heartbreak, depending on who tells the story. But Hanzo kept writing. His collected poems were later found wrapped in a piece of her kimono. Here's your quirky tidbit in some Yoshiwara establishments. The courtesan's services included stagecraft rehearsals, where clients would act out romantic scenes under their direction. One popular scenario involved the client playing a noble forced into exile, and the courtesan portraying the loyal lover, disguising herself as a man to follow him. These sessions had scripts, costumes, even emotional arcs. The client could choose the ending reunion, betrayal, or tragic separation. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they tipped extra. Sometimes they asked to run the scene again, this time with better lighting. But let's step back. What made this all possible was silk, not just as fabric, but as symbol. The Oiran's robes could weigh up to 20 kilograms and be layered in colors that told stories: red for fire, indigo for morning, silver for winter moonlight. The robes weren't fastened with belts, but by intricate knots that took hours to tie and a practiced hand to undo. Silk became a timekeeper, a curtain, a weapon. Some courtesans learned to flick the hem of their sleeve in such a way that it would brush the face of a client, delivering a rebuke without a word. Others scented their silk with plum vinegar or chrysanthemum oil, so their presence lingered after they'd gone. One client wrote that after a single evening, I smelled her for a week. My wife burned the sheets. Historians still debate whether the floating world empowered these women or merely trapped them in aesthetic cages. Some argue they were queens of performance. Others call them cultural hostages. But the most interesting voices are the courtesans themselves. In letters, many speak of love, real love found within the walls of illusion. One wrote, "He never bought me. He saw me when I wasn't rehearsing." Another confessed, "Each role I play is stitched with truth, just not mine." Outside the licensed quarters, echoes of the floating world crept into everyday life. Middle-class housewives copied courtesan hairstyles. Poets wrote haiku in the voice of Oiran. Theaters staged romances set in pleasure districts. Always tragic, always beautiful. Even political satire disguised itself as love tales set in Yoshiwara because no censor dared touch a love story. One popular print depicted a courtesan whispering to a merchant, while in her other hand, she held a scroll labeled State Secrets. The print was banned, reprinted, sold out. As you step back into the night, the district seems to ripple. Lights reflected in puddles become constellations. The air tastes like incense and endings. You realize you haven't touched anyone, but you feel strangely full, not with pleasure, but with narrative. This was always the point. The floating world didn't offer love. It offered the idea of love. And ideas, unlike bodies, don't age. You pass a shuttered doorway and see a robe hung on a wooden hook, pale blue, stained at the hem. You wonder who wore it last. You wonder if she ever chose her own ending. And you wonder if somewhere, folded in a drawer no one dares open, there's a fan with your name on it painted in a language you'll never read, but written for you anyway. The waves slap the hull with a rhythm you're starting to recognize, not quite music, but not quite noise either. Just the endless reminder that the sea never sleeps, never cares, and never waits. You've spent weeks aboard this Portuguese carack, and by now, your skin smells like salt and mildew. Your beard itches from humidity, and your legs ache for land. But you're not here for comfort. You're here for cargo. Spices, mostly nutmeg, cinnamon, clove, the kind that made men kill, cry, and compose bad poetry. But there's something else traded on these ships too. Something unlisted in the ledgers. Love, or at least its closest available substitute. Welcome to the sea-born polyamory of the Portuguese spice trade, where sea wives came with tide charts, guilt got rationed like rum, and homesickness turned into sweaty declarations on rain-soaked decks. You're not alone in noticing. Every sailor on this boat walks around with an extra pouch of longing tucked under their belt. In Goa, they call them bailadeiras. In Angola, nhanha. In Macau, mui tsai. Local women who became partners to European traders, sometimes by agreement, sometimes by force, sometimes by everything in between. These relationships weren't always sweet, but they weren't always brutal either. They were practical, rooted in survival, mutual benefit, occasionally even tenderness. A sailor would arrive in port, strike a deal with a local family or brothel, and form a temporary marriage. Food, washing, shelter, often affection, maybe children, but never permanence. In some records, these women are just wives of the season, dismissed by colonial scribes as placeholders for European mistresses left behind. But if you dig deeper, if you read the songs, the gossip, the whispered warnings passed between older women in the market, you'll hear something else. These weren't just arrangements. They were performances of domesticity under the weight of empire. And sometimes, they flipped the script entirely. Take the case of Maria de Saint-Thomé, a freedwoman from the African island colony, who became legendary among Portuguese sailors for hosting a better table than most governors and reading hearts better than priests. She spoke 3 languages, charged rent to anyone who shared her roof, including lovers, and once threw a Dutch merchant's boots into the sea because he insulted her rice. She took 6 husbands in 20 years, none simultaneously, all documented. The colonial court once tried to fine her for excessive independence. She responded by raising her rental rates and hosting twice-weekly dinners for passing clerics. She never paid the fine. Your sex story tonight, one written in monsoon rain and leftover wine. In Malacca, a ship's log from 1563 records a curious incident. A sailor named João was accused of stealing cloves and hiding them in his lover's bed frame. The woman in question, a Chinese servant named Lin, confessed that she'd let him, but only because he cried like a child and kissed like a ghost. The court was confused. The fine was halved. The magistrate, who reportedly owned a spice plantation, ordered the bed frame destroyed, but later had one made to its exact design. On board the ships, relationships blurred like fog on the sea. There were men who shared women, women who traded sailors. Bonds formed on long voyages, often hardened into unspoken agreements. One rare sailor's journal describes a situation where 2 crewmen took turns sleeping beside the same woman during alternating ports of call. We did not argue. He wrote, "We were brothers in salt and jealousy. What they shared may not have had a name, but it had rules, one of which was this: never fall in love for longer than the wind allows." Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Portuguese captains carried printed booklets, proto-manuals on native customs, which included recommendations for local partnerships. These were not romantic guides. They were practical. Seek women who are aligned with the mission, familiar with Catholic rituals, and know how to cook both fish and confession. One line reads. Another simply says, avoid sisters, not because of morality, but because they tended to unite against men who underpaid or overstayed. And still, these arrangements weren't entirely one-sided. Many local women gained access to goods, legal protections, and social mobility by aligning with traders. In Sri Lanka, women who partnered with European men often gained property rights denied to them by their own colonial systems. Some ran businesses, inns, entire port-side economies. One woman in Mozambique, known only as Dona Clara, was said to own more ships than any man in the region, and she used her relationships not for affection, but for logistics. When a new governor tried to evict her, she shut down spice exports for 3 days. He apologized in writing. Historians still argue whether these relationships were exploitative or empowering, whether love ever truly entered the picture, or if it was always an illusion built on imbalance. But reality, like the sea, rarely stays in neat rows. Diaries and local records are full of contradictions. One sailor writes of a wife who wept when he left. Another admits he stayed an extra week, risking discipline, just to watch his partner braid her hair one more time. One woman reportedly marked departing ships with scratches on a palm tree. When she died, there were 43. Her neighbors added 5 more in her memory, even in Europe. Echoes of these arrangements returned like tide marks. Portuguese women, reading letters from husbands abroad, often found hints delayed returns, vague descriptions of new friends, or sudden obsessions with regional recipes. One noblewoman burned her husband's journal upon his return after reading a passage about a wife who stewed mangoes with more love than any European could match. She did not divorce him, but she never cooked mango again, and through it all, silk persisted not in bolts, but in handkerchiefs, scarves, tiny tokens passed from sea wife to sailor, sometimes scented, sometimes blood-stained, always meaningful. Some sailors stitched names into their jackets. Others kept locks of hair. A few carved initials into the wooden planks of their bunks, visible only by moonlight or gilt. These weren't just souvenirs. They were confessions. So you walk along the deck as the ship pulls into another port. The lanterns of the harbor glow like low promises. The crew stirs. Somewhere below, someone's fixing her hair. Somewhere above, someone is rehearsing his apology. And in the captain's cabin, a letter waits half-written, never sent. It smells faintly of cloves and cowardice. You lean on the railing and wonder if anyone truly belonged to anyone out here. If love could be timed by wind charts. If heartbreak, like cargo, could be declared at customs. You don't know. You only know that tomorrow, another tide wife will appear, smiling like she hasn't heard all this before, and you'll smile back, pretending you haven't told it. The heat hits you like a confession, thick, golden, and unapologetically alive. You're not in some romanticized North African postcard. You're in the Sahel, where the air smells like dust and incense, where the land pulses with gold veins and salt bones, and where trade didn't just pass through, it danced. This isn't just a road, it's a memory. It's where gold and salt moved in caravans so long they blurred into the horizon, and where sacred sex rituals didn't just coexist with commerce, they defined it. Here, the spiritual and the sensual are not opposites. They're twins. And tonight, you're going to step into a world where desire wasn't dirty, it was divine. And where the body was both currency and altar. You're walking through Gao, or maybe Timbuktu, or maybe one of the dozens of vibrant cities that European maps reduced to here be lions. The air is dense with music, mostly drums and lutes, and every face you pass glows with the mix of hospitality and calculation. Merchants here don't shout. They signal with jewelry, with the cut of their robes, with how long they let their gaze rest on yours. Gold is everywhere, not gaudy, but effortless, as if the earth itself just decided to wear earrings today. And then you hear it a chant that doesn't sound quite religious, doesn't sound quite erotic, but pulls something inside your chest like a magnetic cord. You follow it through alleyways, lined with fabric the color of dried hibiscus, until you find yourself in a courtyard, where women with scarred arms and glowing skin are painting each other in patterns made from crushed charcoal and henna. They don't look up. One of them murmurs. You're late. You've stumbled into the edge of a ritual older than most religions, among the Songhai and Fulani peoples, and across the ancient Mande-speaking cultures of West Africa. Sexuality was not something hidden. It was honored. There were entire classes of women trained in pleasure, wisdom, and negotiation who acted as spiritual intermediaries. They were called different names in different places. Yandudu, Bai Fall, Griot. But their role was consistent: to teach, to initiate, to balance. Young men were sometimes sent to them before marriage, not for debauchery, but for education. To learn not just how to touch, but how to listen, how to hold, how to ask. One preserved account from a 14th century traveler, likely Ibn Battuta, mentions a ritual where a man would be blindfolded and led into a hut where a woman would ask him questions about his fears. Only after answering truthfully would he be touched. The body does not open, she said, until the heart is unlocked. It wasn't about seduction. It was about honesty. And yes, about control. But let's not romanticize this too fast. These women also wielded economic clout. They often collected fees not in coins, but in salt slabs or golden beads. They set terms. They trained other women. Some even advised kings. In the Empire of Mali, under Mansa Musa's rule, there are hints in court documents of women whose titles had no European equivalent: part priestess, part sexologist, part economist. One such figure, referred to as Sira Jata, was said to own 3 gold mines and wrote poetry so seductive it was banned in public recitation. Of course, copies still floated around, passed under benches, carved into the backs of talismans. Tonight's sex story. It belongs to the great city of Jenne, a story half whispered in marketplaces and still painted on one ruined wall. It tells of a woman named Nene, born under an eclipse, who was said to have been kissed by a spirit before her first breath. She never married, but took lovers from across the trade routes: Tuareg herders, Moroccan spice traders, Yoruba drummers. She kept a bowl of water by her door, and those who entered would wash their hands in it. If the water turned red, she would send them away. If it stayed clear, they stayed. When asked how she knew who would bring her pain, she said, "The spirit doesn't lie. Only men do." Her house was burned after a regional cleric accused her of witchcraft. She rebuilt it, larger. Here's your quirky tidbit in some ancient West African markets. There was a tradition of sensual singing stalls, small curtained booths where a traveler could pay a griot to sing to him in a low voice, up close, usually with lyrics improvised to reflect his body language. There was no touching, no promises, just voice, and for some, that was enough. One merchant wrote in his ledger, "She sang me back to who I was. I paid in salt." It wasn't enough. And speaking of salt, never forget, it wasn't just seasoning. It was a preservative, a purifier, and a standard of payment so valued that some cities built entire economies on it. Love could be bought with salt. So could betrayal. In some marriage rituals, A woman would sprinkle salt on her lover's shoulder before he left for a journey. If he returned having forgotten her, she would say, "Your salt dried up." That was both insult and truth. One ancient proverb goes, "Gold lies beneath the earth, but salt we carry in our tears." Historians still argue whether these sexual and spiritual customs empowered women or reinforced roles disguised as mysticism. But what's clear is this: these societies didn't fear the erotic. They treated it with ceremony, with rhythm, with rules. The body was not shameful. It was a map. And for those who knew how to read it, it led not to sin, but to balance. And that brings us to the performance. You sit, cross-legged now, in that same courtyard. The drums begin. Slow at first, then faster. The women begin a dance, each movement precise, rehearsed, but not rigid. They're telling stories. One gesture mimics fire, another mimics water, another an open palm. Slowly turning means waiting. A younger dancer moves with particular sharpness. Her silk skirt spins, catching the last light of the sun like it's made of flame. She is new, you can tell. She misses a beat. The others glance but do not stop. She recovers, and when the dance ends, they gather around her, press their foreheads to hers, and laugh not mockingly, but in welcome. You realize you haven't said a word this whole time. You don't need to. This isn't a place where tourists ask questions. This is a place where they remember. So as the sky turns violet and the gold bracelets clink one last time, you step back out into the street. Someone hands you a pinch of salt wrapped in cloth. You ask why. She smiles and says, "So you don't forget what you almost understood." You tuck it into your sleeve. It's still there, hours later, as you lie awake beneath a sky so full of stars it hurts. You don't feel aroused. You feel rearranged, and somewhere behind you, a drum still beats. Not for you, not even about you, but because you were there. Briefly, honestly, and maybe for a moment. True, the moment you step onto the plush carpet, your boots go quiet. The air changes, thickens not with heat, but with layers of scent and tension. Frankincense and cardamom linger on your clothes before you even breathe. You're in a Persian merchant salon now, but this isn't just another stop on the Silk Road. This is where the threads tangle, where espionage is folded into embroidery, where the scent of jasmine doesn't just mean luxury, it means something's being hidden. This is the world of French kisses, Persian carpets, and smuggled desires. Welcome to the showroom of secrets, where every touch leaves a trace and every thread tells a story. You're in Isfahan, once the beating heart of Safavid Persia. Minarets glitter, fountains murmur, and merchants laugh just a little too loudly. But behind all that, a different commerce hums, one woven into the warp and weft of Persian rugs, embroidered letters, and the occasional very inconvenient love affair. Because when East met West on this stretch of the route, they didn't just trade spices or dye, they traded fantasies. Each side convinced the other was more exotic, more dangerous, more alluring. And caught in the middle couriers, courtesans, and people with too many secrets and not enough pockets. Let's talk carpets, not the dusty things in your grandma's living room. These were status symbols, diplomatic gifts, and, in more than one case, coded love letters. French nobles obsessed over them. The finest Persian carpets were said to be soft enough to sleep on, sensual enough to propose on, and intricate enough to hide a confession. One legend tells of a French diplomat who smuggled state secrets sewn into the fringe of a carpet he gifted to Versailles. The note written in lemon juice and visible only under heat, the carpet still on display, the note long gone, or maybe still whispering between the threads. Then there were the kisses. Frenchmen stationed in Ottoman and Persian courts were famous, infamous for cultural exchanges that leaned more romantic than diplomatic. In the early 1700s, a French envoy named Pierre Duval wrote extensively of his language lessons with a merchant's daughter in Shiraz. His official reports were dull. His personal letters, however, were anything but. He described kisses that tasted of pomegranate wine, whispered Persian poetry, and a kind of affection that blurred the line between real and role play. Her name never appears, only the letter A. His letters were intercepted twice. He was recalled, but not before sending back a shipment of rugs, all of which had a stitched pattern near the edge, 2 figures, one cloaked, one veiled, sitting under a date palm. That motif. It pops up again in other diplomatic gifts. Some say it became a signature between lovers who were never allowed to speak openly. Your sex story tonight isn't scandal, it's Sarvara, a Jewish woman in 17th century Safavid Iran, known only as Shoshana, worked as both a carpet artist and a clandestine go-between. She embroidered floral borders during the day and memorized messages by night. Rumor has it she once seduced a Dutch captain just long enough to extract the schedule of a spice fleet, which she passed to a Persian vizier, her payment. Protection for her family, and a silk shawl that she wore only on full moons. When she died, her belongings were burned except for the shawl. It's now housed in a museum, labeled textile, origin uncertain. But if you press your nose to it, they say, it still smells like clove and confidence. Here's your quirky tidbit. Persian perfumers, during the Safavid era, developed an oil blend known as ushq, literally longing. It was not sold publicly, but passed discreetly in wrapped cloths from lover to lover, spy to spy. It contained ambergris, saffron, and crushed date seeds. One recipe even called for a single thread of silk worn for a day against the skin of a beloved. Not metaphor, literal. These perfumed threads were sometimes burned as incense in private rooms where lovers or conspirators met. The smell didn't just mark memory, it masked sound. Some historians believe entire negotiations were conducted under the influence of these burning threads, where every sentence was inhaled instead of heard. But let's talk smuggling, because passion rarely travels legally. French traders weren't supposed to bring Persian silks back into France without paying punishing tariffs, so they hid them in boxes labeled religious pamphlets, in the linings of coats, even stitched into the hems of women's petticoats. One noblewoman, caught at the port of Marseille, had 9 feet of forbidden silk hidden inside her underskirt. She claimed it was for personal use. The customs officer blushed, let her go. 3 months later, she wore it to a royal banquet. The pattern, the same motif from Duval's love letters, 2 figures beneath a palm tree. Historians still argue whether these exchanges of fabric and affection were exploitative, romantic, or just pragmatic. Maybe all 3. What's certain is that both sides left changed. French perfume houses started mimicking Persian distillation methods. Persian court music began to adopt elements of French instrumentation. And in the middle, always, were people like Shoshana. Like the woman with the silk petticoat translating, negotiating, performing affection like it was a diplomatic protocol. And those performances had stakes. One wrong word. You're accused of treason. one misplaced gesture. You've sparked an international incident, but do it right, and you get something better than power. You get access to influence, to protection, to intimacy that, while temporary, was sincere in its own way, even if the kisses were for show, even if the silk was smuggled. The longing was real. You leave the salon at dusk, your hands brushing a tapestry so finely woven it feels like breathing. Outside, the wind has picked up. You see a figure wrapped in red silk walking away from the bazaar. Her step too graceful to be casual. She doesn't look back, but she drops something, a scrap of paper with a line of poetry in French, barely legible. Je me souviens de toi dans chaque fil. I remember you in every thread. You don't follow. You don't need to. Some desires aren't meant to be fulfilled, just smuggled between glances, stitched into carpets, hidden in the perfume of rooms we only visit once. The itch doesn't come right away. First, it's just a tired ache, a sense that your joints are out of sync with your soul, that maybe the food on this ship was a little too pickled and the air a little too thick. But then the red blotches appear. The captain calls it the French flower, and the crew laughs the way people laugh when they're scared. You've stepped into one of history's most uncomfortable paradoxes, the moment where pleasure met plague, where silk stockings hid lesions and spice ships carried more than cloves. This is the era when sex, silk, and syphilis shared quarters on the same vessels, and when a desire for luxury could cost more than gold. Tonight, you're going to walk into brothels, map rooms, and apothecaries, tracing the fevered fingerprints of a world unraveling under its own hunger. You dock in Naples just after dusk. The harbor smells like dying fish and roses. A bad sign. You're immediately directed to the quarantine checkpoint, an old fortress where merchants are inspected not just for stolen goods, but for suspicious skin. The guards don't ask where you've been. They ask who you touched, and how many times. There's no shame and lust here, just risk. The women who wave from balconies still wear velvet, but you notice that none of them make contact. Every pleasure is now a gamble. Every kiss could be a passport stamp or a sentence. This wasn't how the Silk Road was supposed to end. But the 15th century brought more than spices from the East. It brought rumors, symptoms, stories that spread faster than any caravan. The disease, what some called the Great Pox. Others, God's punishment hitched a ride from sailors and soldiers, moving from the ports of Genoa to the powdered faces of Versailles. It made lovers paranoid, merchants desperate, and healers both terrified and rich. Silk, ironically, helped hide it. High society embraced soft stockings, long gloves, and embroidered collars, not just for fashion, but for concealment. A rash on the thigh, wrap it in crimson silk, a sore on the wrist. Add lace. One noble woman in Venice reportedly hosted salons wearing gloves that extended to her shoulders, perfumed with rose oil and vinegar. "I bleed in secret," she wrote in her diary, "but I smile in public." Her lovers numbered in the dozens. Her physicians, even more. And this wasn't just happening in Europe. In the Mughal court, rumors of the foreign boil caused courtiers to begin favoring long tunics and veils, not for modesty, but for discretion. In the Ottoman Empire, hammams posted warnings if you feel faint in the steam. Report immediately. In Edo, Japan, brothels began employing professional inspectors to evaluate clients for suspicious symptoms before entry. One such inspector, a woman named Michiko, was said to be able to spot a syphilitic sore from across the room. Her nickname, the Silk Doctor. Her fee was twice that of the courtesans. Your sex story tonight is both a tragedy and a comedy. A sailor named Luis, docked in Lisbon in 1521, fell in love with a poet who worked in a silk stall near the red light district. She wore her hair wrapped in blue gauze and claimed she could read a man's fate from the way he folded fabric. He visited her for months, sometimes just to talk, sometimes for more. When he fell ill, chills, rash. The usual, he left her a final gift, a scarf embroidered with the line, "You made me forget the sea." She never saw him again. But months later, the scarf reappeared, wrapped around the neck of a different sailor. Historians found her letters. One reads, "Desire is never clean, but it is real." Here's your quirky tidbit in some 16th century apothecaries. Customers could purchase a love map, a satirical pamphlet depicting the human body as a navigational chart. Pleasure zones were labeled with terms like Cape of Moans and Bay of Risk. Hidden within the print, usually near the lower abdomen, was a small drawing of a skull and crossbones. A warning. Beyond this shore, it read, lie storms. These maps were banned in Paris but thrived in Amsterdam. One copy reportedly made it to the court of the Shah in Iran, where it was annotated in calligraphy and stored under humor. Historians still argue whether syphilis came from the Americas, mutated in Europe, or simply revealed itself when global trade made the world too intimate. But no one doubts its impact. Artists painted sores into their mythological scenes. Poets wrote verses about doomed embraces. In one particularly dark play, staged in Florence, a character named Venus is revealed to be a disease masquerading as love. The final line, "I kissed him, then I killed him." And yet, people didn't stop. They kissed anyway. Hugged, whispered in shadows. Even the courtesans who risked everything wore new perfumes, burned sweet grass, kept silver coins under their pillows to absorb illness. Desire didn't die. It adapted. Some brothels developed no-touch menu services that involved sight, sound, scent, but no skin. In Venice, a famed courtesan known only as Bellanot performed poetry readings behind silk screens, her voice low and steady. "I cannot give you my body," she told one client, "but I will haunt your dreams." And that's perhaps the strangest part. The disease didn't kill pleasure, it made it more theatrical, more coded, more desperate. Silk sales didn't drop, they soared. People bought fragrance, art, and love poems like they were life vests. One Italian merchant made a fortune selling cleansing silks garments soaked in herbal mixtures, believed to ward off disease. They didn't work, but they felt like hope. You walk through the alley now, past doors that once opened freely. Some are shut forever. Others creak open just long enough for a hand to emerge, offering not touch, but trinkets. A vial of perfume, a letter, a scrap of lace. You realize that what we call intimacy has always been part illusion, part invention, and sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the body, it's the story we wrap around it. As you pass a mirror hung outside a tailor's stall, you catch your reflection. There's a thread on your shoulder. Silk. You don't know where it came from. You brush it off gently and keep walking, because there's always another port, another story, another risk worth taking, even if the cost is more than coin. A haze of humid air wraps around your lungs the moment you step off the boat. You're in a sun-bleached colonial port. Portuguese flags flutter above sagging warehouses. Spies linger in palm shadows, and the scent of spice is intoxication and curse. You can almost taste the contradictions: sugar sweetness, rum fire, polished wood, and whispered laws. This isn't a dream, it's a colonial love market, where interracial longing is taxed, policed, and paradoxically commodified. Welcome to the intersection where empire and intimacy collide, where desire becomes regulation and romance becomes revenue. The docks are frantic. Ships unload ivory, pearls, tobacco, and human bodies all declared, priced, and inventoried. But beside the customs house, another ledger is being written. Here, liaison fees are recorded. Colors matter: brown, black, white, each with its own tax rate. A black woman dancing with a European sailor. That's a premium pair, a mixed-race child born to free parents. Duty owed. Local laws require registration of interracial unions under the guise of moral oversight. Some colonial governors justified this as public order. Others admitted, off the record, that the fees funded fortifications and official mistresses. Historians still argue whether these policies protected or prostituted. But one thing is certain: intimacy became another export. Strolling down the main thoroughfare, you pass a tavern with a sign that reads in 3 languages: "Love served cheap. Call for license." Inside, laughter tumbles over clinking glasses. At the bar, you meet a woman named Esmeria. She's Afro-Brazilian, leaning on a counter scarred by centuries of trade, speaking Portuguese, Yoruba, and Pidgin English. She tells sailors, "I sell company, not citizenship." She's part of an under-the-table network offering both romance and false documents tempered by favors, alliances, maybe even blackmail. She's not a victim. She's a broker. Among her clients is a Spanish soldier who paid her in maps and manuscripts. Another client pays per smile. Taxes, she laughs, are just another conversation. Night falls, and the port lanterns flicker like fireflies. You slip into a comfort parlor. It looks like a salon. Velvet drapes, framed photographs of patrons, soft music. The women here, Afro-Indigenous, Creole, European, greet you with names printed on cards. On one side is a code, T1B2E3. On the other, service rates calibrated by skin tone, language skill, and accent. Some women speak 4 languages fluently. Some offer poetry. Some offer history lessons. One woman, Marisol, offers diplomatic briefings on French trade partners. For a higher fee, she'll introduce you. These parlors aren't just transactional. They're networking hubs. Intelligence, like affection, is traded. Your sex story tonight revolves around a Creole poet named Celeste. She was memorized by a French preacher who claimed she had a tongue that could curve truths like sugarcane. She hosted salons where she wrote letters for illiterate sailors and gave history lessons on biblical towns now buried beneath sugar plantations. A British lieutenant fell in love with her letters, though they never met. She wrote back of her own accord, and eventually he arrived at her parlor only to be redirected into the custody of the governor. They gave him no trial, but Celeste's letters survived. They're in an archive in Lisbon now. One reads, "I exist between borders. My dear, like salt on open wounds. Choose your pain." Here's your quirky tidbit in these ports. There was a popular game called Passport Seduction. Sailors could bet on which woman would stay the longest, who'd ask questions about their homeland, who'd demand payment in currency rather than coin. The winner got a silk scarf dyed in the same pattern as the most popular vessel in port. A keepsake, a trophy, a memory of fleeting attachment. Colonial authorities ramped up surveillance. In Suriname, marriage licenses required not just signatures, but blood typing and testimonials from community elders. In Goa, European women suspected of mixing blood were fined, their houses searched, their silk dresses inspected for stains. Every liaison could unravel entire families. But colonialists needed the pleasure markets. They needed the intelligence gleaned under negligées. They needed the children born from these unions, because those children sometimes grew into multilingual clerks or loyal intermediaries. The intimacy fueled the administration. Love, here, was both weapon and bridge. A kiss could lower your tax bracket or raise suspicion. One governor instituted a kiss count at official receptions. Unauthorized public affection meant immediate deportation. But the rule was impossible to enforce, so he moved to licensing. Woman approached man. Pay 1 escudo. Consent recorded on parchment. Licenses stamped. If you loved without license, they could punish you. But if you paid, they'd watch and profit and claim it was regulation. Historians still debate whether these systems humiliated or protected. Some argue the records offered security for mixed-race offspring. Others point to them as mechanisms of surveillance and control. The women involved. They navigated a perilous middle ground between exploitation and empowerment. Esmeria and Marisol, Celeste and countless unnamed women, used education, multilingualism, and coded performances to carve space. They sold intimacy but weren't owned by it. They stayed afloat in currents of colonial violence by becoming indispensable confidants. As dawn strains through the shutters, you wander onto the docks again. A ship unfurls sails. Another woman watches from a balcony draped in silk. She touches her necklace, a string of sea glass and coral collected from sailors. She smiles at you as you pass. You don't know her name, but you know she's watching. And that, in this world where intimacy was currency, maybe attention was the rarest form of wealth. It doesn't come with fanfare. No horns, no parades, just a moment you step off a path somewhere between markets and memories, and suddenly the world feels like it's exhaling. This is the end of the trade routes, not a dead end, but a culmination. A long, slow, tangled climax of thousands of years of longing, bargaining, seducing, and surviving. The long orgasm of globalization, as some historians half joke, half lament. Because by now, you're not walking through cities. You're moving through aftermaths. You're tracing the fingerprints left on silks, on skins, on salt-stained love letters never sent. And you realize everything was always about connection. You're in a modern port now. It could be Singapore, Rotterdam, Dubai, or somewhere in between. The smell of diesel competes with roasted coffee and hot plastic. Cargo containers tower like Legos built by greedy children. Digital screens blink with codes coffee from Kenya, laptops from Shenzhen, lingerie from Bangladesh. It's not romantic. It's overwhelming. But if you tilt your head just right, you see echoes of the past. The silk still shimmers. The salt still crusts the skin of dock workers. The perfume lingers. And the seduction, it never left. It just evolved. Now, algorithms swipe right and carry cargo at the same time. But the hunger is the same. The itch behind the ribcage. The need to be seen, touched, remembered. Your story tonight isn't from the past. It's happening now. It belongs to a translator working for an import-export firm in Marseille. A woman named Lena. She speaks 7 languages fluently, and tracks shipping manifests like love letters. She noticed a recurring route: a container from Jakarta always arrived 2 days early. Inside, bolts of fabric. But tucked between shipments, someone had hidden handwritten notes in Farsi and Javanese. Love notes, or maybe spy messages. She didn't know. She didn't tell. She kept them, not out of duty but out of tenderness. She said it felt like reading someone else's heartbeat. Here's your final quirky tidbit. The largest digital trade hub in the world still uses interface terms from maritime days: dock, port, manifest, cargo. But beneath those sterile labels are real lives. Couples texting across time zones. Workers in bonded warehouses who wear silk scarves under their uniforms for luck. A dock inspector in Rotterdam who proposed to his husband by hiding a ring inside a shipment of Turkish delight. Globalization didn't erase emotion. It just industrialized it. And the sex, it's no longer on parchment. It's encrypted in chats, watermarked in OnlyFans accounts, stitched into influencer marketing. One recent anthropologist called the modern love economy a rebranded spice route. Swipe, subscribe, ship. But the dynamics haven't changed. Power, desire, language, and distance still braid themselves into the same old story: I want you. I can't have you. Let's trade something. Historians still argue whether globalization was inevitable or engineered, whether it expanded love or diluted it. But maybe that debate misses the point, because at every step, from the camel caravans of the Taklamakan to the fiber optic cables under your feet, humans have chased each other. Sometimes with coin, sometimes with poetry, sometimes with weaponized longing. And what we find, again and again, is not just goods, not just spices or silk, but reflection. We find ourselves mirrored in someone halfway across the world, wanting the same thing. So now, as you walk through this final port, past cranes and cargo, past vending machines selling aphrodisiacs and Wi-Fi plans, you feel it the same current that pulled Roman senators toward transparent silk, that led Persian lovers to code secrets into carpets, that made a Portuguese sailor cry in the arms of a Malaccan wife. The world spins on trade, but also on ache, on hope, on the belief that maybe, just maybe, we can turn desire into memory, and memory into something worth holding. You pass a dock worker humming a love song. A digital billboard advertises silk sheets scented with oud. A QR code leads to a virtual harem experience. You don't roll your eyes. You smile, because it's all the same story, told in new accents, dressed in new fabric, carried across oceans and servers. And you've been part of it all along. And now that we've reached the end of our journey this long, winding tale of salt, silk, sex, and everything tangled in between, let's slow it all down. Let the images fade a little. You've crossed deserts, whispered in palace gardens, laughed in perfumed courtyards, slept under sails. You've heard stories of lovers separated by borders and time zones, of power wrapped in scarves, of desire carried on spice-laced winds. You've felt the weight of gold and the softness of longing. And now, with the stars blinking above and your breath finally steady, you can let it go. All of it. Let the caravan pass. Let the ships dock. Let the incense curl into the night. Because some stories are meant to stay with you, not as noise, but as quiet. A gentle hum beneath your ribs, like the background music of the world, low and steady. You're safe now. You're home. Just listen to the stillness. Nothing to chase, nothing to trade. Just you, the dark, and the echo of everything that ever made your heart lean forward. Thanks for staying with me. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.